Story 1. The Two Sleeps: How Medieval People Divided the Night. You lie in bed, waiting for sleep to take you. You know that when it does, you're not committing to an unbroken 8-hour span of unconsciousness. You're stepping into a carefully timed pause, a rhythm more familiar to your ancestors than to anyone today. Welcome to the world of first sleep, a concept so ubiquitous for centuries that no one thought to explain it until it had quietly vanished from modern life. Close your eyes and imagine it's the year 1350. You live in a modest village in northern France. The days are short, the nights long. You've finished your evening meal: pottage and dark bread, and you've banked the fire. Candles are precious, and you've already used one too many this week. The light is gone, so you go to bed. But this is not the kind of sleep you know. Not a single, uninterrupted stretch from dusk till dawn. Your mind and body are trained to a different rhythm, two distinct sleeps, with a period of wakefulness in between. In medieval Europe, this biphasic sleep pattern wasn't unusual, it was expected. The first sleep begins. The first sleep, known simply as first sleep or primo somno, typically began around sunset or shortly thereafter. People went to bed much earlier than we do today, often soon after dark, especially during winter when the nights were long and artificial light expensive or unavailable. As you fell into your first sleep, your body slowed. No rush. There were no blue screens, no ticking clocks. The world outside your thatched cottage had fallen quiet. Your neighbors were all asleep too, or nearly so. Historical accounts tell us that first sleep lasted for about 4 hours, sometimes longer. It was a deep, slow-wave sleep, the kind modern sleep scientists identify as the most restorative. People often dreamed during this time, and because it occurred early in the night, dreams tended to be more disjointed, more fragmented, and often more forgotten. You might think it odd that people would wake in the middle of the night, but in pre-industrial societies, this was as natural as breathing. Sleep was not a single block. It was a flowing, dynamic rhythm. First sleep was only the beginning. Midnight wakefulness, the watch. After several hours, almost everyone would awaken, not in panic or confusion, but naturally, peacefully. This waking period between sleeps, sometimes called the watch, could last anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. In this quiet span of time, people did all kinds of things. Some prayed, others tended to embers, checked on livestock, or simply sat in quiet reflection. Married couples sometimes made love during this time. The quiet, dim-lit interval between sleeps was, paradoxically, one of the most intimate parts of the day. The English physician Robert Burton, writing in The Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, described it plainly. They went to bed soon after supper, and after their first sleep, they commonly called it, they would be awake for an hour or two and then return to sleep. No drama, no confusion. This wasn't insomnia, it was simply the expected order of things. This idea of the watch wasn't just mentioned casually, it was embedded in daily life. Manuals on prayer written for monks and laypeople alike included instructions for nighttime devotion, to be performed between first and second sleeps. In France, the term dorveille described this period, a hybrid of sleeping dormir and waking veille. It was understood, ritualized, even cherished. The sleep of the monks. To fully understand this rhythm, we must look to those who lived by the clock of prayer, the medieval monks. In the Benedictine monastic tradition, the rule of Saint Benedict required monks to rise for matins nighttime prayers around midnight or 2:00 a.m., depending on the season. This breaking of the night was intentional, even sacred. Monks weren't unique in waking during the night, but they were the most regimented. Their schedule enforced the structure of biphasic sleep. When they went to bed after evening prayers compline, they would sleep a few hours before the bell summoned them to the chapel. They'd chant psalms in the darkness, wrapped in woolen cloaks, candlelight flickering against the stone walls. Then, after an hour or more of prayer, they would return to bed for the second sleep. What's fascinating is that ordinary people mirrored this rhythm, even if they weren't consciously imitating monks. This suggests that two-part sleep wasn't a religious construct imposed from above, it was a physiological one, shaped by the world before electricity. Why two sleeps? What caused this natural division of the night? Sleep historians believe the answer lies in our circadian rhythms and the role of natural light. In winter, night might last 12 to 14 hours. Without electric light, it's hard to stay awake that long. So people adapted. They slept in two segments. Modern studies support this. In the early 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Weyer conducted an experiment where volunteers were deprived of artificial light and exposed only to natural lighting cycles. After a few weeks, their sleep naturally divided into two parts. One early segment of about 4 hours, a period of quiet wakefulness, and then a second sleep until dawn. It seems that this biphasic pattern isn't an anomaly of the past, it might be our default state, one we lost when artificial light allowed us to extend our days and compress our nights. Descriptions from the past. References to first sleep and second sleep appear throughout medieval and early modern texts. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the character of the wife of Bath mentions "my first sleep" as a routine part of her night. In a 13th century medical text, a doctor advises that the best time to digest food is after the first sleep. The term was so common that no one explained it, much like no one today defines what breakfast is. You just know. Some legal documents even referred to night crimes as occurring between first and second sleep, suggesting that authorities recognized the distinct timing. And it wasn't just in English or French. In the Italian countryside, people spoke of primo sonno and secondo sonno. In Spain, in small hill villages, these terms persisted into the 19th century. The structure endured until something changed. The candle burns brighter. The tipping point came gradually, starting in cities. As urban life expanded, as candles became more affordable, and later, as gas lighting and then electricity spread, people began staying up later. The natural sleep rhythm, shaped by the rising and setting of the sun, was disrupted. A continuous 7 to 8 hour sleep became the modern ideal. But in many rural areas, the two sleeps remained well into the 1800s. It was the spread of artificial light, along with industrial work schedules and cultural shifts, that finally ended the old rhythm of rest. Ironically, this ancient pattern, dismissed by some as primitive or inefficient, may hold answers for today's sleep-deprived world. Those moments of midnight wakefulness weren't considered a problem, they were a gift. A quiet, unpressured time to think, talk, even create. And so, as the embers glow in your hearth and the first sleep draws near its end, a question stirs in your mind. What did people do during those mysterious hours of wakefulness, and how did it shape their thoughts, their dreams, and their sense of night itself? The fire has dwindled to glowing embers. Outside, the village is silent but not entirely still. You stir beneath a woolen blanket, waking without panic, as if guided by some internal bell, one that has rung for generations. You are not alone. Across the countryside, others rise quietly, one by one, from their first sleep to greet the shadowy hours of midnight. You've entered the watch, that ancient interval between two sleeps, and it is far more than just a break in slumber. In the modern mind, waking in the middle of the night is usually seen as a problem. It's labeled as sleep maintenance insomnia, something to be treated, solved, eliminated. But for centuries, that moment between sleeps was normal, even purposeful. The watch was not a disruption. It was an opportunity. A time for prayer. The most common use of the watch was spiritual. It was, quite simply, a time for talking to God. Books of Hours, personal prayer books owned by the literate elite and occasionally by commoners, often included prayers designated for nighttime recitation. Some were meant to be whispered from bed, others required rising, washing, lighting a candle, and reading aloud. These devotions were usually not performed in a rush. There was time. The monk's structured schedule provided a formal version of this rhythm. Matins and lauds, the night vigils of the canonical hours, broke the darkness into sacred segments. Even for those outside the monastery, rising during the night to pray was considered virtuous. There are records of devout laypeople in 15th century England keeping a candle stub and a psalter beside their beds, waking in the middle of the night to say a few psalms before drifting back to sleep. In some homes, especially during Lent or other holy seasons, a household would gather in silence during the watch to hear a patriarch read aloud from scripture or saints' lives by candlelight. This prayerful use of the watch reflects a worldview in which night was not solely a time for unconscious rest, but a fertile space for spiritual reflection. Intimacy in the dark. But not all used the watch for prayer. In married households, it was often a time for closeness. Doctors and moralists in the medieval and early modern periods often advised couples that intercourse was healthiest and least sinful during the watch. Notably, the early modern English physician Nicholas Culpeper wrote that the hours after first sleep were the best time for conception. He wasn't alone. There are numerous references, both medical and literary, suggesting that this quiet interlude was when most couples shared physical intimacy. This advice wasn't merely about health, it reflected practical observation. Couples were less tired after the initial sleep and not yet disturbed by the coming day. The body was rested, the fire still warm, and the night offered quiet and privacy rarely afforded in busy daytime routines. For the poor who often slept several to a bed, or even a room, this moment of privacy might be the only one available. Work by candlelight. Not everyone used the watch solely for private activities. In some cases, people worked. In households where every hour mattered, weavers, bakers, farmers, the watch provided time for light labor. Tasks like mending clothes, carding wool, spinning thread, or even writing letters were sometimes done between the two sleeps. One French physician noted in the 17th century that his patients often performed small domestic chores during their nightly wakefulness, for there was much to be done, and no time wasted. Women, in particular, took advantage of these hours to perform tasks that required concentration but not full daylight: spinning flax, preparing next-day meals, kneading dough left to rise by the hearth. These activities were not hasty, they were meditative. The quiet and solitude made the work flow. Occasionally, laborers would rise to check on animals or tend fires in barns. Night farming might sound strange to us, but before artificial lighting, nighttime work was not about visibility, it was about timing. Some tasks had to be performed at specific intervals, regardless of the sun. Thought and dream. And then there were those who simply sat. During the watch, people thought. They reflected. They remembered dreams from the first sleep. They composed letters in their heads or practiced sermons, arguments, or stories. The mind, freshly rested but not yet reabsorbed into the world, wandered. In 16th century England, a courtier wrote in his diary that he often composed poems during the watch. Another merchant described mentally solving account problems while lying awake after first sleep, only to rise later and write them down. This was not a frantic kind of thinking. There were no clocks to hurry you, no alarms waiting at dawn. There was simply time. Many dream journals of the era mention dreams occurring during the first sleep being remembered and reflected upon during the wakeful watch, and then influencing the dreams of the second. The night was not passive. It was layered, participatory. Light in the darkness. To be active during the watch required some light. Candles were the most common source, though their cost varied by time and region. In wealthy households, beeswax candles might burn for hours. In rural cottages, tallow dips, thick, fatty, smoky, were used sparingly. Some accounts describe people sitting near the hearth, feeding small kindling into coals to stir up a soft glow rather than relight the fire fully. In wealthier homes, a lamp might be kept burning through the night in a corner of the room, set in a niche or a metal reflector to maximize light. But most people didn't need much. the eyes adjusted. In the silence and slowness of the hour, a single candle was enough to mend a hymn or read a psalm. Community and crime. In towns and cities, the watch was also a period of alertness and occasional anxiety. Some professions existed precisely to patrol these hours. The town watchmen or sergeants roamed cobbled streets with lanterns and staffs, calling out the time and checking for fire, mischief, or thieves. Their work was difficult and often thankless but vital. In a world built largely of wood, fire was the ever-present danger. A knocked-over candle, an unattended hearth, and a whole neighborhood could be ash by morning. These watchmen, ironically, were the only people who hoped everyone else would be asleep. But some weren't. Historical court records tell us that a disproportionate number of crimes, theft, adultery, clandestine meetings occurred between the two sleeps. It was dark enough to hide, yet early enough that people might still be caught. The very liminality of the watch, not fully night, not yet morning, made it a space both sacred and transgressive. A rhythm lost. Today, this kind of night seems strange. To wake naturally in the dark and not panic. To accept the space between two sleeps as part of life, not a problem to fix, but a feature of existence. And yet, for centuries, this was normal. So normal, in fact, that people rarely explained it. They simply expected to wake and to use the time well. So why did we lose this rhythm? Electric light is the most obvious reason. As cities grew and lights came on after dark, the watch was pushed later and later until people stayed awake until they were truly exhausted and then slept once in one long stretch. The biphasic pattern broke. Sleep compressed. The watch vanished. But we didn't just lose time. We lost a kind of time, quiet, personal, inward-facing time. Time that wasn't driven by productivity or entertainment. Time for thought, prayer, and whispered conversations. And yet, perhaps it's not entirely gone. Many people still report waking in the night. They check the clock. They worry. They try to force themselves back to sleep. But what if they did? What if they saw it not as insomnia, but as something more ancient? As the embers in your imagination begin to dim again, you might wonder, what was the second sleep like, and how did it differ from the first? What dreams came after the watch, and what meanings did people find in them? The fire has been stirred. The candle has burned low. You've prayed or thought or perhaps spoken softly to your partner. The house is still, the streets outside silent again. No rooster has crowed. No dawn has broken. But your eyes begin to droop. The hour of second sleep has come. You lie back down, not because you are forced to, but because your body invites it. Sleep returns with a gentler hand, easing you back into a quieter, deeper world. And what follows in those last hours before dawn is perhaps the most mysterious and spiritually significant part of the medieval night. The second descent. Second sleep began sometime around 1:00 or 2:00 a.m. and continued until dawn. This period was more variable than the first sleep. It depended on season, household routine, occupation, and climate. In the depths of winter, it might stretch for 6 hours. In midsummer, perhaps only 3. But in nearly every account that survives, second sleep was viewed as distinct, and in many ways more meaningful than the first. Where first sleep was associated with physical restoration, the second was the realm of vision, of mystery, of meaning. It was the time of dreams. Dreaming in the later hours. In pre-modern Europe, dreams were not regarded as random, disposable mental clutter. They were messages, warnings, temptations. Sometimes divine, sometimes diabolical, always worth considering. The second sleep coming after the watch, after prayer or reflection, was considered especially potent for dreaming. It was during this time that the mind, already quieted, already spiritually attuned, might receive something profound. Clergy and laity alike kept dream diaries. In some monastic communities, dreams were shared during morning chapter meetings if they were thought significant. There are recorded instances of monks reporting visions during second sleep that led to changes in communal behavior, increased fasting, or adjustments to liturgical emphasis. The interpretation of dreams was a respected, if precarious, skill, rooted partly in ancient Roman practices and partly in biblical tradition. Medieval dream theory held that some dreams were sent by God, some by angels, others by demons, and many by bodily humors or spoiled food. But dreams during second sleep were sometimes treated as more trustworthy than those during first sleep. Why? Because they came after the watch, a liminal space in which the soul was prepared, cleansed, or focused. The mind was no longer burdened by the fatigue of the day, nor quite ready for the demands of morning. It was open. The return to sleep as a ritual. Returning to bed after the watch wasn't like falling asleep at the end of a busy modern day. It was gentle, even ceremonial. Some households had small prayers specifically for re-entering sleep, verses recited under the breath while lying down. One such prayer from a 15th century Flemish text reads, "Lord, grant me again thy peace, that in this sleep my soul shall cease to fear the dark or dread the fire, but rest in thee my soul desire." Even commoners may have whispered informal versions of this, blending folk tradition with Christian belief. Children were often sung to, even after midnight. In some Germanic households, a second lullaby was common, one for bedtime, another for returning to sleep after a brief wakefulness. The second sleep, then, wasn't an afterthought. It was part of the night's sacred shape. The role of roosters and bells. Eventually, the second sleep ended not with an alarm, but with sound. In rural life, the rooster played this role. Its call, unpredictable but insistent, was one of the few time cues available. It signaled to the peasant that the light was returning and work would soon follow. In towns and cities, bells marked the end of sleep. Church bells tolled for morning prayers, lauds, or primes, sometimes as early as 4:30. Monks rose yet again, for the third time in the night, to chant psalms under dim gray skies. For farmers, the first light brought a swift transition from rest to work. A bucket of cold water to the face, bread or porridge, milking, the day had begun. And for most, the rhythm was consistent, day after day, season after season: first sleep, watch; second sleep, dawn. Literary echoes of second sleep. You can find scattered references to second sleep in diaries, poems, and even court records. But what's notable is how casually it's mentioned, a sign of how normalized it was. In an early 15th century English poem, the narrator laments, "In my second sleep, why saw a fear, a vision strange, full dirk and clear." In other words, during my second sleep, I saw a fearful vision, strange and both dark and clear. The poet does not explain what second sleep is because he doesn't need to. His readers know. In court testimony from a 1612 burglary trial in Sussex, a witness states, "I heard the dogs bark between the first and second sleeps," anchoring the time of the crime by the structure of the night, not by the clock. Even in medicine, doctors would ask patients whether their discomfort came during first or second sleep, different symptoms, sometimes corresponding to different humoral imbalances, according to prevailing theories. A cycle lost to time. By the 19th century, second sleep had largely disappeared from cultural awareness. Industrial schedules demanded punctuality. Shift work began to distort sleep patterns even further. Electric light extended waking hours and compressed sleep into a single block. The cultural memory of biphasic rest faded. In 1840, a French doctor remarked on how modern Paris had begun to ignore the body's natural divisions of rest, forcing men to deny their second sleep, to rise unnaturally early, and to labor before their blood is even warm. Today, if someone tells you they wake in the middle of the night, they likely mean it as a complaint. But a medieval villager wouldn't have blinked. The idea of sleeping for 7 to 8 hours without interruption would have seemed as strange to them as a glowing smartphone would seem to a 14th century monk. And yet, the wisdom of their sleep, broken though it was, may hold something valuable. A rhythm of rest that accommodated the mind's movement. A night divided not by struggle, but by design. Reflections in the modern world. Modern science has begun to circle back to these ancient truths. Studies of isolated humans deprived of artificial light often reveal a natural return to segmented sleep. Sleep therapists sometimes advise patients with insomnia to embrace, not fight, the midnight wakefulness, to read, stretch, even pray, as their ancestors did. Some have suggested that the pressure to sleep in one continuous block is itself a cause of insomnia, that if we accepted our wakefulness, rather than feared it, we might sleep better in two parts. The medieval world did not know about melatonin or REM cycles, but it knew the feel of the night, the slow passage of time by firelight, the rustle of straw, the softness of second sleep. As the sky slowly brightens and the cock crows in the distance, you might wonder, if our ancestors lived and thrived under a different sleep rhythm, one of two parts, divided by quiet reflection, what have we lost by abandoning it? And what might we regain? Story 2. Peasant pillows and noble bedchambers, the hierarchy of rest. Imagine yourself in a single-room cottage on the edge of a barley field. The roof is low, the walls rough, and the air tinged with the sharp smell of smoke and straw. It's winter. Outside, a cold wind pulls at the wooden shutters, but inside the fire has been banked for the night. You're settling down, not in a feathered bed or a private chamber, but on a pallet, a rough layer of straw laid directly on the packed dirt floor. This is not just sleep, this is survival. When we talk about sleep in the Middle Ages, it's easy to focus on kings and queens or on the rituals of monks. But most people, the vast majority, lived and slept as peasants, cotters, and villeins. Their rest was not just shaped by culture or theology, but by scarcity, labor, and the hard realities of rural life. A shared space. In the medieval countryside, a single room often served every purpose: cooking, eating, sheltering animals, and sleeping. The medieval peasant family lived communally. Parents, children, infants, grandparents, even farmhands or occasional travelers all shared the same enclosed space, particularly in winter when separate outbuildings were cold and impractical. At night, the family would spread straw across the floor, or across low wooden frames if they had them. The straw was sometimes topped with old linen sacks or blankets if available. There were no sheets, no pillows as we know them. Clothing often served double duty: a folded tunic under the head, a cloak as a cover. Some households might have a rough wooden bedstead shared by parents, with children nestled around or under it. Even small animals sometimes came inside: lambs, goats, or chickens, especially in harsh winters. They produced warmth, and their safety was a priority. Privacy as a concept did not yet exist. The pillow as a privilege. Peasants did not often have pillows, at least, not soft, stuffed ones. In inventories of rural English households from the 13th and 14th centuries, pillows are rarely mentioned. When they are, it's usually as a single item, owned by the head of the household. These were often simple cloth sacks filled with chaff, dried moss, or coarse wool. Not luxurious, just a buffer between a tired skull and a hard surface. In some regions, heads were rested directly on a rolled-up cloak or a wooden bolster. In others, people slept propped against a wall, sharing body heat with others. Comfort was a secondary concern. Warmth and protection from damp were the priority. Compare this to urban or noble inventories, where beds might list multiple cushions or pillows with feathers, often embroidered or scented. These weren't just items of comfort, they were status symbols. The straw mattress, seasonal and shared. Straw was the mattress of the peasantry, but it was not permanent. Straw beds had to be replaced or at least fluffed and dried frequently. Moisture, Mold, fleas, lice, and mice were constant concerns. Some households dug shallow depressions into the dirt floor and filled them with straw, lining them with animal hides if available. Others laid out rush mats or bracken fern beneath the straw to create insulation. These straw beds were not individualized. Families often slept piled together. Infants were sometimes placed in cradles or hammocks hung from beams to keep them away from trampling feet or curious animals. But older children slept with their siblings, or even in the same pallet as adults. The communal bed offered safety and warmth, but also challenges. Illnesses spread. Privacy, again, was absent. But in the peasant world, survival outweighed comfort. Clothes and covers. Few peasants owned multiple sets of clothing. Most wore their outer tunics even to bed, stripping only their heavier belts or shoes. Linen underclothes, if they had them, might be washed occasionally, but outerwear was often slept in. Blankets were scarce. Some used woolen cloaks for cover. Others shared coarse wool throws, sometimes woven at home. Poor households might have only one large piece of cloth for the entire family, rotated between those who were ill, elderly, or nursing children. In England, legal records occasionally refer to coverlets stolen from cottages. These were rarely decorative. Most were functional, patched, heavy, and used year-round. Heat and hearth. The hearth was the heart of the peasant home. Located centrally, it provided heat, light, and the means to cook. It also served as the only source of warmth during sleep. There were no chimneys in most rural homes until the late medieval period. Smoke from the fire drifted upward and escaped through a hole in the roof. The air was acrid, but the fire's warmth was vital. People slept close to the hearth not just for warmth, but because the fire was a living thing, needing tending to ensure that the family could relight it each morning. Ashes were piled over glowing embers to preserve heat overnight. Children were sometimes assigned to rise during the watch to check the fire. In some regions, flat stones or metal pots were heated in the fire and placed beneath beds or pallets, rudimentary bed warmers. The fire kept spirits away, according to superstition. It also kept death at bay, in the very real sense of preventing frostbite. Night sounds and threats. Medieval peasants did not sleep in silence. The night was filled with sound. Dogs barked, livestock groaned or shuffled, wind howled through gaps in thatch, rats rustled, people snored, children coughed, creaking beams shifted under the weight of snow or rain. The night was not empty, it was full. Beyond the home, dangers loomed. Bandits, wolves, spirits according to local lore. Windows, if there were any, were small and shuttered not to let in light, but to keep out the world. Doors were barred with wooden planks or braced with beams. The medieval peasant didn't fear only weather or illness, they feared the dark. Superstitions abounded. Charms hung near the door, prayers whispered before sleep, protective signs carved into wood or drawn in chalk near cradles. Sleep was not just physical rest. It was vulnerability. Families entered it together, trusting that they'd wake. How the poor woke. Peasants didn't wake by clock, but by cue. The rooster, the cold, the stirrings of animals, or the slow gray light creeping through slats in the wall, these were the alarms of the poor. In summer, sleep ended early. In winter, it lingered. But rising was never leisurely. The fire had to be rekindled, water fetched, food prepared. Life resumed quickly because life demanded it. And so the cycle repeated. Night was rest, yes, but also duty. Rest was earned after labor, and labor waited just beyond the morning mist. The medieval peasant did not sleep in comfort, but they did sleep deeply, communally, seasonally, and sometimes with a contentment born of physical exhaustion and simple routine. But what of those who didn't sleep on straw? What of the nobleman in his feather bed, his canopy drawn, with tapestries to keep out the cold and servants to light the way? What did it mean to sleep in a bed of privilege, behind a bolted door, with embroidered pillows and velvet-lined coverlets. Was it truly comfort or just another kind of ritual? Step now across the threshold of a very different room. The stone walls are thick and cool. Heavy drapes cover tall, narrow windows to block the night air. Tapestries line the walls depicting scenes of saints and battles. A carved wooden bedstead stands elevated, almost like a stage, crowned with a thick canopy of embroidered cloth. Beneath it, a feather-filled mattress and a cluster of stuffed pillows await. A fire flickers in a tall hearth, recently stoked by a servant. This is not a space for mere survival. This is a bedchamber, the sleeping world of medieval nobility. The contrast with peasant sleeping conditions is dramatic, but comfort wasn't the only function of elite sleep. In noble circles, rest was laced with etiquette, hierarchy, spiritual symbolism, and even surveillance. To sleep in privilege meant to participate in a nightly ritual far more complex than lying down and closing one's eyes. The bed as symbol. In medieval noble life, the bed was not just furniture. It was status and sometimes ceremony. A bedstead in a lord's chamber might stand waist-high, supported by carved posts. Feather mattresses, costly and reserved for the wealthy, were stacked atop straw and wool layers for warmth and elevation. Sheets were made of linen, often finely woven, sometimes scented with herbs or rosewater. Blankets, or coverlets, were wool or fur, and some had velvet or brocade trimming. Canopies and bed curtains served more than decorative purposes. They held in warmth, muffled sound, and shielded the sleeper from drafts. In a world with no central heating, the enclosed bed was a practical cocoon and a private stage. In royal and high noble households, the great bed of the master was often displayed publicly. Visitors might be received in the chamber, where the bed was the focal point, a visual sign of power and prosperity. In some cases, audiences were even held in the bedchamber, with the lord or lady reclining among pillows, draped in fur-lined robes. The more extravagant the bed, the more it reflected a family's lineage, influence, and wealth. Rituals of retiring. The act of going to bed was formalized in noble households. One did not simply go to sleep. The process involved multiple stages. First, a servant would prepare the bed, straightening the linens, adjusting the pillows, warming the mattress if necessary with heated stones or metal pans filled with coals. In wealthier homes, the sheets might be perfumed or scattered with dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, or chamomile, believed to calm the spirit and ward off pests. Next came the act of disrobing. This was often not done alone. Nobles were undressed by attendants. Clothing was removed layer by layer, shoes first, then outer tunic, belt, and underclothes. The garments were often inspected, brushed clean, and hung or folded. In some cases, particularly in France and England, this bedtime routine was public. In royal courts, a monarch's coucher bedtime ceremony was an event, attended by courtiers. The king or queen might speak with advisors, issue commands, or even entertain guests while being prepared for bed. Finally, the noble would climb into the bed, often with assistance. The curtains would be drawn, the fire banked, and the door secured. Privacy and proximity. Despite the grandeur, privacy was often limited. In smaller castles or noble manors, a family might share one chamber. Servants or ladies-in-waiting often slept nearby, sometimes on pallets in the same room or in adjoining spaces, ready to assist during the night. In royal palaces, the sleeping arrangements of monarchs were a matter of court protocol. For instance, in 14th century England, Queen Philippa of Hainault maintained a private bedchamber but was rarely alone in it. Her ladies slept nearby, and her confessor often visited her chamber during the night for prayers or urgent matters. Bedchambers were sometimes shared between high-ranking guests. When the Holy Roman Emperor visited France in the 12th century, he was honored with the sharing of a royal bed, not in intimacy, but in formality. To sleep beside a king was to be affirmed as trusted and equal in status. Still, noble households often maintained divisions between male and female quarters, or between formal and informal sleeping spaces. The lord and lady might sleep apart or together depending on status, health, or the time of year. Servants of the night. The noble did not tend the fire. The noble did not fetch water. Those tasks belonged to chamber servants. In well-staffed homes, a valet de chambre or chamberlain might remain nearby throughout the night. Duties included adjusting the fire, lighting candles if the lord awoke, preparing warm wine or ale, and responding to any emergencies. Some households employed a night porter, a servant stationed near the sleeping quarters to control entry after dark. Security was a concern. Doors were locked, bolts drawn, but human watchfulness was essential. The presence of servants meant that nighttime needs, spiritual, physical, or emotional, could be met quickly. It also meant that few nobles were ever truly alone. Dreaming under velvet. Nobles, like peasants, dreamed, but their dreams carried different weight. In noble culture, dreams were often recorded or interpreted not only by confessors, but by astrologers and clerics. A vivid dream might be considered a divine message. Nobles, being closer to power and by some views to God, often took such visions seriously. There are recorded cases of lords altering plans based on dreams, delaying travel, changing battle strategies, or donating to a monastery. Dreams were consulted as omens, especially before military campaigns or important marriages. One example, Eleanor of Aquitaine reportedly dreamed of a serpent before a major political betrayal. The dream was interpreted by her chaplain as a sign of treachery, and it later proved apt. To sleep in wealth was not to sleep without fear, but it meant having the means to respond to fear, whether by prayer, superstition, or servants. Night clothes and accessories. Unlike peasants who often slept in their daily tunics, nobles had specific garments for sleep. Nightshirts made of fine linen or even silk were worn by both men and women. These were looser than day garments and often embroidered at the collar. Wealthy women sometimes wore nightgowns with decorative stitching, while men might don a sleeping cap, a practical item in cold chambers, but also a marker of leisure. Night clothes were occasionally scented or blessed. In the courts of Burgundy and Naples, records show that garments were sprinkled with rosewater before bed. In some religious households, nightwear was embroidered with crosses or devotional imagery. Pillows, too, were scented. Dried herbs like mint, lavender, or marjoram were sewn into small sachets and tucked inside the cases. These were thought to ease breathing, repel vermin, and calm the mind. Sleep as political display. Noble sleep was not always restful, it could also be strategic. In royal households, decisions about who was granted access to the bedchamber and when were political. To be allowed into the sleeping space of a monarch or great lord was a sign of trust, sometimes of power. In 15th century Burgundy, the practice of lever and coucher, rising and retiring, was institutionalized. Attendance at these rituals became a sign of influence. If you were present at the duke's bedside, you were inside the circle. This blurring of sleep and politics created a world in which bedtime was a performance, rest a public act. Even the choice to not sleep to hold vigil, or pray through the night, could be a statement of piety or grief, especially during mourning periods or before battle. Sacred sleep. For the devout noble, bedtime was a spiritual act. Prayers were recited before entering the bed. Crosses were made upon the body. Some slept with relics beneath their pillows or hung small crucifixes above the bedstead. The act of sleep was likened to death. And so, a noble might prepare each night as if it were the last, confessing sins, offering thanks, and seeking protection for the soul in case the body did not wake. The Book of Hours, a popular devotional item among the wealthy, included prayers, to be said before sleep. These were often illustrated with miniatures of sleeping figures, angels watching, or Christ at rest in the tomb. In this way, the noble bedchamber became a holy space. Sleep itself was an act of faith. While the medieval peasant slept beneath thatch and straw, the noble slept beneath velvet and carved oak. But both entered sleep as a necessary surrender. One slept out of exhaustion, the other out of ritual. Both were vulnerable. But what about the liminal spaces, the inns, the monasteries, the guest houses where strangers shared beds and pilgrims sought rest on the road? What kind of sleep occurred in places where neither poverty nor wealth ruled absolutely? The road winds through valleys and hills, muddy in places, littered with stones. You've walked for hours or perhaps days on your pilgrimage to Canterbury, or to Santiago, or to some distant monastery known for healing waters or a saint's relics. As night approaches, the horizon dims to ash and you search for shelter. You are not a peasant sleeping in your own cottage, nor a noble retiring to a canopied chamber. Tonight you sleep among strangers. Between the rigid world of the manor and the humble world of the village existed another landscape entirely, the realm of communal rest. Inns, monasteries, and guest houses of the medieval world offered a third way to sleep, one shaped by hospitality, improvisation, uncertainty, and an often awkward intimacy. The shared bed as a fact of life. In the medieval world, sharing a bed with a stranger wasn't shocking. It was normal, expected even. Inns rarely had private rooms. Most offered shared halls lined with beds, sometimes 2 or 3 to a room, other times entire dormitory-style spaces with pallets on the floor. A traveler might find himself sharing a bed with a merchant, a soldier, or a monk, sometimes all at once. Chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries mention this casually. A clerk traveling to Paris writes that he found rest in a bed with 2 Germans already there. Another English pilgrim notes that he slept side by side with a goodly knight, though he snored like a bear. The practice cut across class lines. While nobles traveling with their own retinue might arrange for private sleeping arrangements, even they sometimes shared beds in smaller towns or religious hostels. It was not considered shameful. It was practical. Inns and their beds. The medieval inn varied in quality. Some were respectable establishments run by guilds or church-approved operators. Others were crude, little more than large houses with extra space. Beds ranged from decent straw mattresses with coarse sheets to bare pallets with thin coverings. Linen was rarely changed between guests. Cleanliness was relative. Despite this, inns often did their best to provide order. Some used partitions or curtains for modesty. Others offered different prices for floor space, straw bundles, or shared beds. A 15th century English inn record list charges as follows. 1 bed shared 2 pence. Clean blanket added 1 pence. Private corner space, if available, 3 pence. Of course, privacy was a flexible term. Doors didn't always lock. Snores, whispers, shifting bodies, and creaking wood formed the soundscape of sleep. Hospitality and monastic rest. Monasteries offered another kind of refuge. According to the rule of St. Benedict, hospitality was sacred. Every monastery had a guest house or hospitium, where travelers, especially pilgrims and clergy, were offered shelter. These guest houses were often cleaner than inns and came with fewer risks. The bedding might be basic, but guests were afforded quiet, safety, and sometimes a hot meal. Men and women were lodged separately. Pilgrims might sleep in shared rooms with other travelers, monks, or novices. At Cluny and Monte Cassino, guest houses had structured routines, evening prayers, simple meals, and early rising. In smaller monasteries, guests sometimes slept in unused cells or in barns with extra bedding. The beds were straw or wool, with woolen blankets and occasionally a wooden headrest. Some abbeys kept a bed ledger, recording guests, names, and sleeping arrangements, a kind of proto-hotel register. sleeping in churches and chapels. In desperate times, people slept in holy places. Travelers caught on the road after dark sometimes sought shelter in church porches or near shrines. This was common during festival seasons, especially when inns overflowed. In urban areas, cathedrals allowed pilgrims to rest in covered areas, though usually not in sanctified spaces. There are records of entire groups sleeping within cloisters during feast days. This was tolerated, though rarely encouraged. Clergy might offer straw, water, or a blanket to the needy, especially during winter. For many, the idea of sleeping near sacred relics was comforting, even protective. Dreams dreamt near shrines were believed to be more powerful, more honest, and more likely to carry divine meaning. Bedbugs, thieves, and night fears. Communal sleep had its hazards. Thieves operated in inns. A traveler might wake to find his purse gone, or worse, a knife at his throat. In some regions, gang activity infiltrated lodging houses, especially near ports and border towns. Bedbugs and lice were rampant. Few innkeepers had the means or knowledge to fully clean straw mattresses. Guests often inspected beds before settling in, shaking out sheets and using cloaks as a protective barrier. Privacy, too, was non-existent. Conversations were overheard, secrets leaked. The darkness of night invited both intimacy and intrusion. Despite this, the shared bed had its comforts. Warmth. For one in a world without central heating, body heat was a resource. In unfamiliar places, sleeping beside another could provide a sense of security. Companionship softened the sharp edge of loneliness. Nighttime rituals on the road. Even in these shared spaces, rituals persisted. Pilgrims might kneel to pray before sleep, murmuring familiar Latin phrases or invoking saints. Merchants tallied coins or reviewed parchments by candlelight. Soldiers cleaned gear. Priests whispered scripture. The bed became, if not private, at least personalized, each sleeper clinging to habit as protection against the foreign world around them. In wealthier inns, candles were extinguished by innkeepers after a curfew hour. In religious guest houses, the great silence began with night prayers, and all talking ceased. People often brought their own small bedding bundles, blankets, cloaks, or mats. A good traveler carried rope to secure possessions, wax tablets for notes or prayers, and herbs to ward off insects. Preparedness was key. Sleep disrupted and renewed. Travel disrupted circadian rhythms. Journeys were often dictated by weather, terrain, or festival schedules. Sleep was caught in fragments: an hour on a wagon, a nap beneath a tree, or a full rest in an inn if fortune allowed. Many travelers spoke of the road itself as a form of penance, not just the blisters or hunger, but the broken sleep, the discomfort, the night fears. And yet, these moments were often some of the most spiritually vivid. Pilgrimage diaries are filled with dream accounts, many occurring in inns or barns. A traveler from Bohemia reported a dream in an Italian guest house where a woman in blue placed her hand upon my shoulder and told me I was near the bones of a saint. He later discovered the local church kept relics of Saint Clare. The dreams of the road were considered liminal signs sent in motion, given meaning by location, fatigue, or prayer. The return home. When the journey ended, so did the shared bed. Travelers returned to their familiar rhythms, to the dirt floor cottage or the velvet-curtained canopy, but the memory of communal sleep remained. Some found it humbling, others liberating. The bed, after all, was a place of transition from the safety of home to the uncertainty of the road, from the world of the known to the dream world beyond. In the medieval world, sleep was rarely solitary. It was shaped by proximity to family, to power, to strangers, to God. Whether on straw, feather, or stone, it reflected who you were, where you were, and what you needed to survive. But what happens when sleep isn't personal at all, when it becomes organized by bells, discipline, and ritual prayers? How did monastic life reshape the very structure of the night, turning sleep into obedience and silence into salvation? Story 3. Monastic midnight prayers between sleeps. The silence in a monastery at night is not quite like other silence. It is structured, deliberate, cultivated. Even darkness here follows a schedule. You are not free to rest when your body desires you rest when the bell permits it. You do not rise in confusion as one might in a peasant's cottage. You rise with intention, summoned by ritual. This is monastic sleep, and it does not belong to you. The life of a medieval monk was organized around the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, but followed in various forms throughout the Middle Ages. This rule did not merely guide work or worship, it defined when you could sleep, how long, in what position, and even what you might dream. To understand medieval sleep fully, one must understand how those who devoted themselves to God experienced the night. The architecture of time. The medieval monastery was governed by time not as measured by the sun or mechanical clocks, but by the divine office, a set of 8 canonical hours spaced throughout the day and night for communal prayer. These were matins nocturnes, middle of the night around 2:00 a.m. Lauds dawn, prime first hour of daylight 6:00 a.m. Terce mid-morning, sext noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers evening, compline just before bed. Matins, the midnight vigil, divided the night. Compline marked the beginning of sleep. Lauds signaled the end. Monastic sleep was therefore interrupted by design structured into 2 parts, not by accident but as an act of religious discipline. Compline, the curtain of night. The final prayer service before bed was compline, derived from the Latin completorium, the completion of the day. Around 7:00 or 8:00 p.m. the bell rang. Monks gathered in the chapel for quiet psalms and readings. This service often included Psalm 4, "I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety." Compline created a spiritual boundary between the toil of the day and the vulnerability of the night. Afterward, monks observed the great silence, a vow of complete quiet from the end of compline until morning. No talking, no noises beyond what was necessary. The monastery became a sea of hush. Monks retreated to their dormitories, long, cold rooms lined with individual beds, or, in some orders, communal sleeping platforms. Light was minimal, heat, in most cases, non-existent. The dormitory. The Benedictine dormitory was austere. Wooden beds or pallets were spaced evenly. Each monk had a straw mattress, a woolen blanket, and a habit worn even during sleep. Pillows were rare. Beds were arranged by rank or seniority. The dormitory was often located above the chapter house or cloister, accessible only to members of the community. In some monasteries, it was connected by a private stair to the church, so that monks could descend silently in the dark for matins without passing through public areas. Sleeping was to be face up, hands crossed or at the sides, no indulgent curling or turning. It was believed that posture influenced the soul. Clothes were not removed. Modesty, even in sleep, was vital. Monks slept in tunics, ready to rise at a moment's notice. This readiness was both symbolic and practical. A monk's life was one of continual vigilance. Matins, the midnight summons. Several hours after compline, a bell rang again. It was now deep night, what we'd consider 1:00 or 2:00 a.m. time for matins, the longest and most demanding of the offices. The monks rose quickly. No stretching, no delay. They walked in silence, candlelight flickering along the cloister walls. The service of matins was held in the cold dark of the church. Psalms were chanted, not sung with passion, but recited with solemn cadence. Depending on the season and the monastic rule, matins might last 45 minutes to 2 hours. Monks stood, sat, knelt. Some nodded off a constant battle between devotion and fatigue. Older monks were excused from standing for long periods, but they were still expected to attend. One chronicler wrote of a novice swaying like a reed during matins, caught between sleep and song. This service had a dual function. It was both prayer and spiritual warfare. Night was the time of demons and dreams. Matins was a way of pushing back the dark. The return to bed. After matins, monks were allowed to return to the dormitory, but sleep did not come easily. The body was chilled, the mind alert from psalms. Still, the second sleep began. This return to bed mirrors the two-sleep structure found across Europe, but here, it was deliberate, not incidental. Monks sometimes recorded dreams from this second sleep in personal journals. The late hours, when the body had been purified by prayer, were believed to produce purer dreams less influenced by sin or appetite. Some monks slept only briefly before rising again for lauds, the dawn prayer. Others, particularly older or infirm members, might remain in bed and pray privately from their cells. Discipline and deviation. Monastic sleep was idealized, but not always perfectly observed. Records from several abbeys describe sleepy monks collapsing in pews, nodding off during matins, or snoring loudly during lauds. One Benedictine prior in the 12th century noted that more than one brother did sleep while chanting and drooled upon his psalter. Some monks secretly broke the great silence. Whispered jokes, stolen sips of ale, or even the quiet sound of dice rolling on stone have been mentioned in disciplinary records. But such behavior was rare. The rule was internalized, and for most, sleep was accepted as part of their vow. Not a reward, but a tool, one to be used in service to prayer. Sleep as a moral act. In monastic thought, sleep was not just a physical need. It was a spiritual risk. Too much sleep weakened the soul. Too little could tempt pride. Sleep should be enough to restore the body, but never so indulgent that it dulled the senses. Benedict's rule allotted 6-8 hours of sleep in winter and slightly less in summer. Naps were permitted only under illness or old age. Sleeping during the day was frowned upon. Some monks practiced intentional deprivation, reducing their hours of sleep as a form of penance. Others used waking hours after matins for additional prayer, seeking holiness in vigilance. Yet over time, reforms adjusted these harsh routines. The Cistercians and Carthusians, among others, introduced more humane schedules in the 12th and 13th centuries, allowing longer rest or greater privacy in cells. Still, the ideal remained: sleep but not too deeply, rest but remain alert to God. The night and the soul. The monastery treated night not as empty time, but as sacred opportunity. In the stillness of pre-dawn, the soul was most open. The darkness, far from being feared, was the canvas on which monks wrote their lives of prayer. Sleep became a bridge from one prayer to the next, from one psalm to another world. And so, while others in medieval society slept according to season, labor, or luxury, the monk slept by bell and candle. His dreams were policed, his blankets few. His night was not his own. But what of those monks who couldn't sleep? What of the nights when devotion faltered and the mind wandered? Was the silence of the cloister truly peaceful, or did it amplify doubts that could not be spoken aloud? The bell has rung. Matins is over. The candles have been snuffed. The chapel, once echoing with chanted psalms, now sits cloaked in darkness again. The monks retreat in silence along stone corridors, the cold biting at their sandals. Some lie down and slip easily back into second sleep, but others lie awake. In a monastery, wakefulness after prayer wasn't always holy. For some, it was the hour of torment, a time when the silence was too thick, too heavy, when thoughts refused to rest. Doubts crept in like drafts beneath the door, and in the absence of conversation or distraction, the mind had nowhere to go but inward. For medieval monks, sleep was both necessary and dangerous. It was a battleground, and many fought quietly beneath woolen blankets, struggling not against the world but against themselves. The lonely hours after matins. By rule, after the conclusion of matins, monks returned to bed for several more hours of rest until the next bell, often lauds, at dawn. But this period, suspended between darkness and light, was liminal. The monastic dormitory was silent, the communal sleeping space filled with rustling blankets and the breath of men trying to sleep. And not all succeeded. For some, the wakefulness following matins was a gift, a time to reflect, to meditate, or to whisper prayers to saints and angels. But for others, it was a time of temptation, of fear, of mental anguish. A 12th century Carthusian monk wrote in his journal, "The devil comes to me in the second sleep, when the tongue is silent but the heart is loud." Vigil or insomnia. There is a tension in monastic writings between intentional vigil and unintentional insomnia. One was holy, the other suspect. To stay awake for the purpose of prayer, voluntarily rising for additional devotions or scripture was encouraged. Saints were often depicted praying through the night, battling fatigue to stay in communion with God. Some monks set aside sleep entirely during Lent, engaging in near-constant vigil. But unchosen sleeplessness was different. If a monk could not return to sleep after matins, he was to remain still, silent, and inwardly prayerful. Yet not all could manage this. Documents from various abbeys record monks who struggled with repeated insomnia, often accompanied by anxiety, melancholy, or what might today be recognized as depression. One novice at Cluny was described by his confessor as tormented nightly by restlessness, rising to pace though forbidden, weeping without cause. These episodes were not dismissed, but they were not fully understood either. The vocabulary of mental health was lacking. Sleep disturbances were framed as either spiritual trials or signs of personal weakness. The night as trial. Monastic theology viewed the night as a time when the soul was tested. The devil, according to many sermons, worked most powerfully between midnight and dawn, whispering to the mind, suggesting impure thoughts, stoking memories of past sins. For the monk, the second sleep could become a crucible. Thomas of Kempis, in The Imitation of Christ, wrote that, "In the lonely hours of darkness, one may find either angels for company or demons for distraction." If a monk dreamt too vividly, especially of food, lust, or past pleasures, he might confess the dream, fearing that it was a sin in disguise. Some monks confessed not the dreams themselves, but the enjoyment of them. Others confessed merely remembering them too clearly. The boundary between the waking and dreaming self was morally porous. Sleep was not a refuge, it was a spiritual battleground. Physical causes, spiritual interpretations. Of course, not all wakefulness was rooted in theology. Physical conditions could cause insomnia, cold dormitories, hard beds, hunger, aging bodies, and illness. Older monks, in particular, often struggled to sleep through the night. Their ailments, rheumatism, gout, fevers, were not well treated, and medical care was rudimentary. Yet sleeplessness was rarely excused. In one Cistercian record, an elderly brother was chastised for nodding during lauds, though he had risen for matins only to lie awake in his bed afterward. His lack of sleep was seen not as misfortune, but failure, a sign of spiritual undiscipline. Some abbeys adapted. The Cluniac reforms in the 10th and 11th centuries included changes to sleeping arrangements for older monks, warmer rooms, permission to rest during daylight hours, and reduced expectations at night offices. Still, the prevailing culture was one of endurance. A monk was not expected to be comfortable. He was expected to be faithful. Nightmares and visions. Not all nocturnal experiences were mere restlessness. Some monks encountered terrifying dreams, visions that were interpreted as warnings, punishments, or tests. The dialogues of Saint Gregory the Great record multiple stories of monks who dreamt of hellfire, of the devil dragging souls away, or of God rebuking them for hidden pride. In these accounts, the dreamer often awoke shaken, confessed immediately, and sometimes altered their life drastically. Yet not all visions were frightening, some were ecstatic. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux described being visited during the second sleep by a form of light, neither flame nor star, which spake peace to my soul. He saw this not as imagination, but as divine encouragement. He recorded the dream, meditated on it for weeks, and eventually composed sermons inspired by the experience. Dreams were serious business in the cloister. They were tools for discernment, but they could also be sources of suffering. Forbidden thoughts in the dark. Silence in a monastery was intended to clear space for God's voice, but for some monks, especially younger novices, that silence became an echo chamber. Doubts crept in, about vocation, about salvation, about the purpose of endless chanting and self-denial. Some lay awake wondering what their life outside might have been, imagining families, careers, adventure. One novice, in a letter to his spiritual director, confessed that, "When others sleep, I lie in my bed and think of my father's forge, and the horses I once fed, and wonder if God would be so cruel as to call me from joy into silence." Such thoughts were not shared aloud. To do so was dangerous, but they were common. Confessors and abbots recorded dozens of such cases, especially among the young. Sometimes, sleep itself was feared not because of nightmares, but because it opened a door to memories. Coping strategies. Not all monks succumbed to despair. Many developed personal strategies for managing wakefulness. Some repeated psalms silently under their breath until sleep returned. Others fingered prayer beads, not rosaries as we know them, but early paternosters as a physical anchor for the mind. One monk tied a small crucifix to the bedpost and would reach for it when anxious, gripping it tightly as a gesture of surrender. Another described imagining the faces of saints carved into the monastery's choir stalls, trying to recall their expressions from memory to calm himself. Still others, especially later in the medieval period, turned to writing. Journaling was permitted in some orders, especially among educated monks. These nocturnal pages often blend theology, confession, poetry, and longing. Sleep, or the lack of it, became part of their spiritual autobiography. A culture of controlled vulnerability. The cloister attempted to control vulnerability by regulating time, but the mind is not always obedient. Sleep was one of the few moments when a monk could not be watched, corrected, or guided. In that way, it was both dangerous and deeply personal. Some monks embraced this privacy, others feared it, but all were shaped by it. Monastic sleep, then, was not just broken by bells, it was broken by thoughts. As the second sleep faded and the gray light of lauds crept into the sky, monks rose again, tired or renewed, uncertain or peaceful, but always obedient. Yet even in obedience, there were variations. What happened when different monastic orders like the Cistercians or Carthusians chose to reshape the structure of sleep entirely? Were they seeking comfort or something more radical, a purer form of rest? The bell rings again, but this time it's different. There are no bustling footsteps, no echo of sandals on stone, no long line of sleepy monks filing into a shared dormitory or descending into the chapel cloister. Here, in this monastery, you sleep alone in a small, bare cell, under a vow of silence that goes deeper than words. This is not Cluny, not Monte Cassino. This is the world of the Reformed orders, where even rest was stripped down to its essence in pursuit of something more perfect. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, not all monks were content with the spiritual life as it had been inherited from earlier traditions. To them, the grand dormitories, heavy meals, and elaborate liturgies of older orders like the Cluniacs were distractions. They longed for simplicity, for silence, and in seeking to reform monastic life, they reformed sleep as well. The reforms begin. The Cistercians, founded in 1098, were among the first major reforming movements. Their motto was strict observance. They rejected what they saw as the worldly comforts of earlier Benedictine monasteries, rejecting decorative art, rich food, and excessive ceremony. This austerity extended to the dormitory. In contrast to the opulent cloisters of Cluny, Cistercian monasteries were marked by stone, whitewashed walls, and simplicity. Yet they still slept in communal dormitories. The difference was in tone and intention. Beds were identical straw mattresses on wooden frames, and each monk had minimal bedding. Silence was even more strictly observed. The monks slept in their habits and rose as a unit. But this was just the beginning. Some reforms went further. The Carthusian cell. The Carthusians, founded by Saint Bruno in 1084, created one of the most radical monastic models in the medieval world. They combined the solitude of hermits with the stability of cenobitic communal life. Each Carthusian monk lived in complete solitude in an individual stone cell, complete with a tiny garden, workbench, and bed. And so, for the first time in Western monasticism, sleep became a private act. The Carthusian day was divided into strict periods of prayer, work, and rest. The monk rose at midnight to chant the night office alone in his cell, sometimes walking to a central chapel for communal services on major feast days, but otherwise remaining in his isolated room. After matins, he returned to rest. The two sleeps rhythm continued, but now in silence, in solitude, in spiritual privacy. Carthusian cells were unheated, minimally furnished, and often freezing in winter. The monks wore thick habits, and their beds, a wooden plank with straw or a thin mattress, were seen not as comfort, but as cross. One Carthusian wrote, "In the night there is no one to disturb me, no one to see me sleep. I rise and pray in my bare cell, and if I return to sleep, I do so knowing that no eyes but God's are watching." Solitude and sleep. This solitude changed the very meaning of rest. In communal monasteries, sleep was a shared event. One was always conscious of others, of snores, of footsteps, of the rhythm of the room. But in the Carthusian world, sleep was yours alone. Your dreams were private. Your wakefulness, however troubling, was unknown to others. This led to a deeper personalization of sleep practices. Some Carthusians, with the blessing of their prior, kept unusual sleep schedules, waking to pray more often, or sleeping in shorter bursts to increase their mental focus. Others practiced mortification, sleeping without a pillow, removing the blanket in summer, or deliberately interrupting their own rest to meditate on suffering. And yet this solitude brought peace to many. Some Carthusians recorded profound spiritual clarity during these hours, reporting that dreams became less disturbing, thoughts clearer, the night more peaceful. They had in effect tamed the night. Camaldolese and hermit sleep. The Camaldolese order, founded by Saint Romuald in the early 11th century, followed a similar path. Inspired by both Benedictine tradition and Eastern eremitic hermit ideals, Camaldolese monks lived in isolated cells or small hermitages, gathering only for certain liturgies. Their views on sleep were influenced by the Desert Fathers, early Christian monks who lived in Egyptian deserts, sleeping little and praying often. Camaldolese monks adopted abbreviated sleep schedules, often rising multiple times a night. One directive from a Camaldolese guidebook instructed monks to lie down not in pleasure, but in obedience to the needs of the flesh, and to rise before the body could become accustomed to comfort. They viewed sleep almost suspiciously as a bodily indulgence that needed to be curtailed, shaped, and offered up as sacrifice. The influence of Eastern Christianity. These Western reforms were not without precedent. In the East, Orthodox monasticism had long emphasized vigil over rest. The monks of Mount Athos, an Eastern Orthodox monastic republic, observed severe night schedules, often rising at 1:00 a.m. for orthros, equivalent to matins, then remaining awake until dawn in prayer and meditation. Some took only short naps throughout the day and night, practicing a form of polyphasic sleep that mirrored the patterns later found in modern sleep studies. The goal was not rest for its own sake, but wakeful awareness nepsis, a spiritual state of constant watchfulness. These traditions, while geographically distant, influenced reform-minded Western monks who saw the body not as an enemy to be abused, but as a vessel to be strictly disciplined. Medical reactions to monastic sleep. By the 13th century, some physicians and scholars began to critique the harsh sleep practices of the Reformed orders. In his 1270 medical text, De Conservanda Sanitate, the scholar Arnaud de Villeneuve warned that excessive waking in the night, as practiced by monks, may cause dryness of the brain, tremors, and melancholy humors. There were documented cases of monastic sleep deprivation, leading to illness, digestive problems, hallucinations, and what would now be called nervous exhaustion. Still, for most reformers, these warnings were secondary to spiritual goals. To them, sleep was not healthcare, it was spiritual training. Reform spreads and softens. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many of the stricter reforms began to soften. Practical adaptations were made to accommodate aging communities, failing health, and shifting cultural norms. Even Carthusian monks in certain houses were allowed thicker bedding in winter. Some Cistercian abbeys introduced more flexible sleep schedules, or allowed afternoon rest on feast days. These changes were not seen as compromises, but as adaptations, a way to keep the spirit of reform alive while acknowledging human limitation. Interestingly, as these monastic reforms filtered out into lay society through writings, sermons, and confessions, so too did the idea of shaping sleep intentionally. Noble households, influenced by reform literature, began to adopt stricter night routines, scheduled prayers before bed, rejection of luxurious sleep arrangements during Lent, or even partial vigils on holy days. In this way, the monastic approach to sleep spread beyond the walls of the cloister. A quiet legacy. Though many of these reforms faded with time, especially after the upheavals of the Reformation, the memory of them lingered. The image of the monk in his bare cell, waking in the night to chant psalms in the dark, became a symbol of spiritual discipline. Even in modern times, echoes of this discipline remain in religious communities and in the popular imagination. The solitude of the Carthusian, the silence of the Cistercian, the sleeplessness of the hermit, these were not just quirks of history. They were deliberate attempts to reshape human rest, to bend it toward eternity. When we sleep today privately, in silence, according to our own schedules, we forget that there was a time when sleep was not personal, not flexible, not free. In the monastery, it was regulated. In the Reformed orders, it was reinvented. And in both cases, sleep became a form of devotion. But as night fell outside the monastery, how did those in the towns and cities navigate the darkness? Who kept watch over their sleep, and what dangers or comforts filled the urban night? Story 4. Candles, firelight, and the cost of darkness. The sun has set, and with it so has visibility. The town is cloaked in shadows. There are no street lamps, no electricity, no gentle glow from nearby buildings. The sky is moonless, the stars mostly hidden behind smoke from hearths and chimneys. Inside your home, whether cottage or manor, darkness presses against the walls, and unless you're among the few who can afford to fight it, your night begins now. In the Middle Ages, light after dark was a luxury. The ability to see once the sun had vanished was not a given, it was a matter of wealth, labor, and caution. Lighting your home, even with the most basic tools, came with costs, financial, physical, and sometimes spiritual. Unlike today, night in the medieval world wasn't something to be lit up. It was something to be endured, respected, and managed as carefully and sparingly as possible. Firelight is the heart of the home. The primary source of light after dark, Was the hearth the central fire that warmed, cooked, and faintly illuminated the home? For many peasants, this was the only reliable source of night light. The fire burned in an open pit or stone hearth in the middle of the room, its glow dimmed by soot-covered walls and low ceilings. There was no chimney in most early medieval homes. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, and the room remained hazy even during the day. After the evening meal, the fire was banked covered with ashes to preserve the embers for the morning. This was a practiced, almost sacred act. Starting a fire from scratch was no small task, especially in wet or windy seasons. Preserving embers meant preserving life. Even when burning, the fire provided only a small, flickering pool of light. Beyond it, the room fell into deep shadows. People learned to navigate their homes by touch, not by sight. The candle precious and reserved. Candles were not common household items for the poor. They were handmade, time-consuming to produce, and expensive to buy. Their light was faint and brief. Two main types existed. Tallow candles made from animal fat, usually sheep or beef, cheap and foul-smelling when burned. These were accessible to peasants and used in poorer households or for basic tasks. Beeswax candles, sweet-smelling, slow-burning, and clean. These were expensive and primarily reserved for churches, nobles, and monasteries. In fact, the possession of beeswax candles was often an indicator of social status. To light one in your home meant you had wealth. To burn several at once for a feast or ceremony was a sign of prestige. In churches, the glow of beeswax was part of spiritual atmosphere. The flickering flames symbolized divine presence, and candles were offered to saints in supplication. But few could afford that luxury in their own homes. Candle usage in practice. In middle-class or wealthier households, a candle might be lit for reading, writing, sewing, or private prayer. But it would be used sparingly, moved from room to room, or even shared between family members. Candlesticks were valuable objects. In poorer homes, a wedge of wood or clay served as a holder. In wealthier homes, bronze, pewter, or even silver fixtures might be used, sometimes fitted with reflectors to increase brightness. Lighting a candle was not a casual act. In many homes, children were forbidden to touch them. They were too precious to waste and too dangerous. The dangers of light. Every form of artificial light came with risk. An open flame in a thatch-roofed, timber-walled home was a constant fire hazard. Entire villages burned down because of a fallen candle or untended hearth. This danger was deeply embedded in the medieval mind. Laws were written to regulate nighttime fire use in towns. In many places, the curfew bell, from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, rang at dusk, signaling citizens to extinguish or bank their hearths. Lighting candles or torches after curfew in public spaces could result in fines or suspicion of criminal intent. In monasteries, candles were often closely supervised. Younger monks were assigned to monitor flames, especially during night offices. A single mishap could destroy centuries of manuscripts. And so, medieval people developed a respectful, even cautious relationship with light. It was not a right, it was a responsibility. Torches and rushlights. Other sources of light included torches, bundles of twigs or cloth soaked in fat, used outdoors or in large halls. These burned brightly but quickly, spat sparks and gave off smoke, suitable for short use or carried by a servant during night travel. Rushlights, dried reeds dipped in fat, cheaper than candles and used by the lower classes. They burned unevenly, gave off little light, and required frequent tending. Rushlights were often wedged between stones or into metal holders with clamps. They were used for simple tasks, tending to children, preparing food, or moving through dark homes. Some were clever enough to time them. A 12-inch rushlight might burn for 15 minutes. You could mark intervals and use them to measure time. But they smoked, they sputtered, they burned out without warning. They were unreliable, but they were something. Lanterns and windows. Lanterns made from horn, parchment, or thin cloth were used to shield flames and make light more portable. These were rare in peasant homes, but more common in urban settings or among tradesmen who worked early or late. Windows, though, offered little help at night. Most were small and shuttered. Glass was a luxury, and open windows let in cold, insects, and danger. During the day, they allowed limited light. At night, they were sealed. In towns, people sometimes hung lanterns outside windows during festivals or religious processions. But most homes were dark. Entire neighborhoods might fall into silence and shadow once the sun set. The night watch. In towns, darkness was not empty, it was watched. The night watch, employed by city councils or lords, patrolled streets with lanterns or torches. They kept time, prevented fires, and checked for thieves. In some towns, they called out the hours and whether midnight and all is well. Their light was the only one visible to most. In cities like London or Paris, laws required some inns and taverns to hang lamps outside their doors, partly for travelers, partly to aid the watch. But most streets remained unlit. Even main roads might be pitch black by midnight. People traveled by moonlight, by memory, or not at all. The luxury of reading at night. To read after dark was a sign of class, time, and purpose. In noble homes or monasteries, someone might read by candlelight a prayer book, a legal document, a romance. But this was limited. Reading taxed the eyes, and candles were expensive. Books themselves were rare, and most were read aloud during the day or by firelight. Silent reading, especially at night, was rare and noteworthy. It required quiet, privacy, and light, all rare commodities. A monk who stayed awake after Compline might read by a single candle, often under blanket or cowl. Laypeople read even less frequently at night. For most, reading was a daytime activity. Night belonged to other tasks or to rest. Symbolism of light and darkness. Light was more than a tool. It was a symbol of safety, knowledge, and holiness. Darkness represented danger, ignorance, and sin. In sermons, preachers compared the righteous to candles burning in a dark room. The devil was said to operate in shadows. Saints were often depicted with halos of light, and Christ called the light of the world. But medieval people did not fear all darkness. They knew its rhythms, its necessity. They respected it. They used light sparingly. They let shadows guide their routines. They did not seek to abolish night, only to live with it. To light a candle in the medieval world was not trivial. It was costly. It was deliberate. It was often the only thing standing between comfort and fear, between sleep and worry. But for all its fragility, that tiny flame changed the meaning of night. Yet what happened when the candle was snuffed, the fire was banked, and the doors were locked? How did medieval people protect their homes and their dreams from the dangers of the night, both real and imagined? The fire is banked, the door is barred. The single candle has sputtered out, leaving behind a faint trail of smoke and the scent of tallow or wax. You lie in bed or perhaps on a pallet, close to the hearth, not quite asleep but not fully awake either. The shadows of the room have settled, but outside the walls, the night stirs with possibilities. In the medieval imagination, darkness was never empty. It was full of dangers, of spirits, of crimes whispered through alleyways and countryside footpaths. The cost of darkness wasn't just material in the wax you burned or the firewood you used. It was also emotional, psychological, spiritual. Sleep was a vulnerable state, so medieval people guarded it fiercely with latches and prayers, charms and customs, watchmen and weapons. Because when the world went dark, it was no longer entirely your own. Locking down the night. Before the invention of the modern lock and key, medieval people still had ways of securing themselves after sundown. The front door was not simply shut, it was fortified. Most homes used wooden bars, slid into brackets or grooves to hold the door closed. In urban areas, iron latches or crossbeams were installed, especially in merchant homes or upper-class dwellings. The doors of stone houses might feature double bars and bolts, particularly in towns where night crime was more common. Windows were shuttered, not glassed in most cases, but covered with wooden slats or thick cloth. These were secured with pegs or internal hooks. Barns and storehouses were locked if locks were available, or sealed with ropes, iron rings, and even wax seals for accountability. In rural areas, people sometimes tied string between doors and small bells. If the door was opened at night, the bell would jingle, alerting the household to an intruder or a spirit, depending on one's beliefs. Fires, friend and foe. Banking the fire, covering it with ash to preserve embers, was done as a matter of routine, but it was also a form of protection. A full blaze was rarely left unattended. The risk of fire spreading was too great. Most buildings were constructed of timber, thatch, and wattle. One spark could take down an entire village. And so, the fire was suppressed, though never fully extinguished. Embers had to be coaxed back to life in the morning, a task usually assigned to the wife or eldest daughter. Still, many fires did break out at night. Town records across Europe note the damage from late-night house fires, often caused by unattended hearths or overturned candles. In places like London, Nuremberg, and Bruges, curfew laws required residents to extinguish their flames before a set hour. Failure to comply could lead to fines or worse, blame for accidental deaths. The curfew bell was not just a call to rest, it was a warning. Fear of burglars and bandits. The night was a time for thieves. This fear was not imagined, it was real and documented. In towns, especially after markets or festivals, opportunistic burglars struck homes while their owners slept. They entered through unlocked shutters, roof slats, or even by tunneling beneath foundations. In wealthier homes, valuables were hidden under floorboards, within walls, or inside locked chests secured with iron bindings. Some towns imposed nightly watch duties on citizens. These guards, often unpaid and chosen by rota, patrolled the streets with staffs, lanterns, and the authority to challenge any who wandered after dark. In Paris, as early as the 13th century, night guards were ordered to stop and question anyone out after curfew. A common greeting was, "Who goes there? Friend or foe?" In English towns, the phrase was similar, "Stand and declare yourself." Still, these watches were inconsistent. Some guards drank, slept, or looked the other way in exchange for bribes, and so households remained on edge. No matter how thick the door or loud the bell, fear seeped in with the night air. Wolves and wild creatures. In rural Europe, wolves were not just symbols of fear, they were an actual danger. In France, the Gévaudan region saw repeated wolf attacks in the late Middle Ages, with records describing children dragged from homes, livestock slaughtered, and hunters disappearing. The woods were not romanticized, they were a source of dread. Doors were locked, animals were brought inside, and tales were told of werewolves, of spirits that could take animal form, of black dogs with eyes like coals. These stories weren't just for entertainment. They were explanations for why people never returned from the forest, or why their dreams were filled with teeth and howls. In the Alps, cowbells were hung outside homes not only to keep track of cattle, but to scare off wolves and other nocturnal beasts. The sound of metal was thought to confuse malevolent creatures. Spirits and the supernatural. For many medieval people, the danger at night wasn't just criminal or animal, it was spiritual. The hours between midnight and cockcrow were often called the devil's hour. It was said that demons wandered then, whispering temptations into sleeping ears. The air was heavy with bad dreams, not merely psychological phenomena, but messengers of evil. To protect against these dangers, households turned to charms, small metal crosses, saints, medallions, or herbs like rue, hung above cradles or over doorways. Symbols, pentagrams, crosses, or runes carved into wood or stone near thresholds. Prayers, especially from the Book of Hours, to be said before bed. Some households recited Psalm 91 nightly. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night. Holy water, sprinkled on the bed or used to anoint the forehead before sleep. In England, people left bowls of salt or bread at the foot of the bed offerings to keep wandering spirits away. Midwives often gave new mothers small stones or amulets to place under the mattress to prevent the night hag from smothering them in their sleep. A medieval explanation for sleep paralysis. Dreams as warnings. Dreams were not private curiosities. They were social and theological events, and they could be warnings. A dream of a black dog might signal betrayal. A dream of falling signaled pride. Repeated dreams could be a sign of sin or divine displeasure. People remembered their dreams seriously. In some towns, dream interpreters, usually clergy or wise women, were consulted the following day. In wealthier households, scribes or confessional journals recorded dreams for spiritual analysis. Dreams that occurred between first and second sleep were considered especially potent visions granted when the soul had been cleansed by prayer. And if the dream was troubling, protective actions followed. Prayers said, candles lit, symbolic washing or fasting performed to purify the sleeper. Children and sleep. Children were especially vulnerable in the medieval night. Cradles were often placed near the hearth, within arm's reach of the parents. Infants were swaddled tightly, both for warmth and to prevent sudden movement which, it was believed, left them open to spiritual attack. Lullabies often included lines invoking saints or angels. Sleep, child, sleep. Saint Michael thy soul keep, and Mary thy dreams guide, till morning comes and fears subside. It was not uncommon for mothers to recite full prayers aloud, as they rocked their children, not to lull them to sleep so much as to shield them from unseen forces. The medieval night was not taken lightly. It was guarded, watched, surrounded with prayer and precaution. People did not trust it, but they didn't try to conquer it either. They moved with it, prepared for it, and hoped to wake on the other side of it unharmed. Because in the dark, the world could be very near and very far away. But how much did all this protection actually cost? What was the price of light, warmth, and safety, and who could afford to pay it night after night? When we think of the medieval night, we often imagine flickering torchlight, the gentle glow of candles in a quiet chamber, or monks hunched over manuscripts by warm oil lamps. But this imagery hides a reality that was far more material and costly than it appears. Illuminating the night wasn't just a spiritual endeavor or a matter of convenience. It came at a very real price in time, labor, resources, and wealth. Light was not a right, it was an expense, and most people, frankly, couldn't afford much of it. We explore the actual economics of medieval night lighting, how much candles really cost, who profited from their production, what resources were used, and how this shaped the rhythms of medieval sleep, work, and survival. The price of a candle. Let us begin with the humble candle, an object now so ordinary that it barely registers as a luxury. In medieval Europe, it was anything but. A single beeswax candle, according to some 14th century English inventories, might cost as much as a laborer's full day's wage or more. In some regions, even tallow candles, the cheaper, smokier variety made from animal fat, were prohibitively expensive for commoners. Here's a rough breakdown from late medieval English records. Beeswax candle 12 inches, tilde 1 penny or more. Tallow candle 12 inches to a half penny. Day labor's wage, pennies day, variable by region and period. A peasant working dawn to dusk could just barely afford 1 candle per day, but that expense had to compete with the need to buy bread, ale, salt, or fabric. As such, most rural households didn't light candles regularly. They lived and slept in darkness. The wealthier classes, monasteries, and churches could afford to burn multiple candles at once, and for long periods. Monastic records show candle usage carefully accounted for, and sometimes rationed, especially during winter. Light, like food, had to be budgeted. Raw materials, bees, fat, and forests. The true cost of light went far beyond the coin. It was ecological and labor-intensive. Honeybee beeswax. Beeswax required beekeeping, which was itself a skilled and seasonal occupation. Hives had to be maintained, bees protected, and wax carefully harvested. Honey was the more immediate economic reward. Wax was a byproduct, used for religious candles, seals, and medicinal balms. The Catholic Church had a near monopoly on beeswax, demanding it for altars and processions. This kept the price high and the supply low for ordinary people. Monasteries often had dedicated apiaries and candle makers, further separating religious life from lay experience in terms of nighttime comfort. Cow tallow. Tallow was made by rendering animal fat, typically from cows or sheep. It was accessible in theory, but in practice, only after other needs were met. Meat was scarce for the poor, and what animals they owned were more valuable alive. When slaughter occurred, every part of the animal had to be used. Hide for leather, bones for tools, organs for food. Fat was needed for cooking and soap. Making candles from it meant sacrificing other essentials. And the smell, often rancid, cloying, and smoky. Tallow candles were not symbols of comfort, they were used out of desperation. Evergreen tree firewood. Illumination often came from open flames, especially hearths or rushlights. These demanded fuel, and firewood was both physically and economically costly. Forests were often regulated by lords or religious orders. Peasants needed permission to gather wood or faced steep fines. The practice of wood gleaning, collecting fallen branches rather than cutting, was common among the poor. A household might spend days each month gathering enough fuel to last through winter nights. In towns, firewood was sold in bundles, priced by weight or cartload, often prohibitively expensive for the very poor. The candle trade and urban industries. By the 13th century, many European towns had established candle-making guilds, particularly in cities like Paris, Bruges, and London. These artisans were known as chandlers, makers, and sellers of candles and soap. Wax chandlers, a more elite version, working specifically with beeswax. Candle makers were vital members of the medieval urban economy. They managed supply, regulated prices, and controlled production standards. In many towns, chandlers were among the first to have dedicated workshops, often near markets or churches. Some specialized in producing funerary candles, towering wax offerings used in wealthy burials. Others served monasteries, lighting their chapels and scriptoria through long, dark winters. But this was a luxury business. The poor rarely visited a chandler unless it was for a small tallow stub before a vigil or birth. Oil lamps and imports. In southern Europe, particularly in Italy, Spain, and parts of the Byzantine East, oil lamps were common. These used olive oil, which burned cleaner than tallow and was readily available in warmer climates. However, olive oil was rare and costly in northern Europe. There, lamp oils were often made from fish oil, nut oil, or animal fats, all of which smelled strongly and burned inconsistently. Even where oil lamps existed, they were usually fixed in place, either mounted on walls or suspended from hooks. Portability was limited, and the cost of oil made all-night burning impractical. The result: oil lamps were used sparingly, often reserved for religious use, craftspeople working extended hours, or inns serving travelers. Labor behind the light. Every source of light, candle, fire, lamp, represented hidden labor. A servant had to rise before dawn, to rekindle the fire. A wife or daughter might spend hours dipping tallow candles. A woodsman risked lords, wrath gathering fuel. A monk brewed rendered wax, poured into molds by rote. A peasant trudged to market, haggling over a single rushlight. Even carrying light was a labor. Torches burned quickly and needed to be replaced. Lanterns were heavy and awkward. To attend a midnight vigil, fetch a midwife, or answer a call from a neighbor required effort, cost, and often coordination. Lighting the night was never passive. It demanded action, and that action was built into the structure of daily and nightly life. The social divide of nighttime comfort. As with many things in medieval life, class dictated access to light and nighttime comfort. The nobility had multiple candles per room, servants to tend fires, beds with canopies, and the luxury of reading or conversation after dark. The clergy, especially in monasteries, were granted candle allowances and relied on spiritual significance to justify their use. The townspeople had limited access, perhaps one candle per household, or a communal light in a workshop or tavern. The peasantry, they had firelight, rushlights if lucky, and the memory of the sun. This disparity was visible in architecture. Manor houses had multiple rooms, allowing candles to be moved. Peasant homes had a single space, where the hearth served all needs. Town homes might have window shutters designed to reflect candlelight, while rural cottages were designed to contain smoke and retain heat, not light. Even death reflected this divide. The wealthy were buried with wax candles, the poor with none. Strategies for saving light. Given the cost, most people developed ways to stretch their limited illumination. Working by sunlight, tasks requiring vision were done during the day. Weaving, reading, writing, and even cooking were timed with daylight. Early bedtimes, the sun set and so did you. In winter, people often slept 12-14 hours, divided by the two sleeps method. Moon-based activity. Outdoor work at night was often scheduled around full moons. In fact, some town fairs were planned to coincide with bright nights. Shared lighting. A single candle might serve several people. Entire families huddled around the hearth or used one rushlight to finish tasks. Reflectors and mirrors, rare but clever. Polished metal behind a candle could double its effective brightness. Some churches used reflective glass. Prayer by darkness. Many prayers were memorized. Devotions could be done in darkness. The soul's light, they believed, needed no flame. Modern comforts in historical context. Today we flip a switch and banish darkness. Our cities glow all night. Our homes are never truly black. But in the medieval world, the presence of light meant someone paid for it in coin, in labor, in time, in care. The average person went to bed not because they were tired, but because there was no reason to stay awake. They had done what they could. The candle was out. The wood was gone. The embers smoldered. And the dark was free. Even so, there was peace in the darkness, rest, stillness, a time to dream, to reflect, to surrender the world for a while, and perhaps to find comfort not in the flame but in the quiet that came after it. When all light was earned, night meant something different, not absence, not emptiness, but a space between moments of effort, a time to let go and let the dark do what it would. Story 5. The bed as a fortress, sleep and security in the Middle Ages. You are in bed. The room is dark. The fire has been reduced to faintly glowing embers. The wind outside presses softly against the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once. You draw the covers tighter and listen, just in case. This was a normal moment in medieval Europe. But unlike the modern bed, a site of comfort, relaxation, and quietude, the bed in the Middle Ages was often something quite different. A defensive structure, a private stronghold, and at times, a very literal fortress. In this story, we explore the overlooked role of the bed in medieval life as a place not only for sleep, but for safety, how people defended themselves while at rest, how the bed offered shelter from both physical and social threats, and how the simple act of lying down was often accompanied by fear, planning, and even strategy. The bed as a zone of protection. Today, a bed is often understood as a private and peaceful domain, but for much of medieval history, privacy did not exist as we know it. Sleep occurred in shared spaces, in open halls, or in corners carved out for temporary comfort. Thus, the construction of the bed itself became a form of protection. Especially for the elite, beds were enormous canopied constructions, often draped with heavy curtains on all sides. These weren't only to keep out the cold, though that was important, they were also meant to offer concealment from prying eyes, barriers against drafts and insects, a separation from shared or public space, an illusion of control over vulnerability. Curtains could muffle sounds and obscure sight. They created a psychological barrier, transforming the bed into a room within a room. For lords, nobles, and some wealthy merchants, the curtained bed was both luxury and necessity, a reminder that even at rest, one could never be too secure. Sleeping fully dressed. In many medieval households, especially in lower classes or colder regions, it was not uncommon for people to sleep partially or fully clothed. Nightgowns were not standard attire for all. Clothing served several purposes. Insulation. Thick woolen garments trapped body heat through frigid nights. Readiness. In case of fire, animal attack, or human intrusion, one was already dressed to flee or fight. Shared beds. Families often slept communally. Clothing maintained modesty. In urban environments where fires or thefts were more likely, men might sleep with a dagger or staff within reach. Chronicles even mention soldiers and guards sleeping in armor, or at least keeping parts of it nearby, to shorten response time. This constant readiness was not paranoia, it was practical. Walls were thin, locks were unreliable, and protection during sleep was a matter of daily concern. Bed placement and defensive architecture. The location of the bed within a home also reflected security priorities. In peasant cottages, beds were typically placed against the wall, often in the warmest and most concealed corner near the hearth but not directly beside it. This positioning served to maximize warmth, to limit exposure from windows or doors, to keep sleepers away from sudden intrusions. In castles and manor houses, the lord's bedchamber was often placed on the uppermost floor, accessible only via narrow, winding staircases or guarded corridors. The layout of the home reflected a logic of defensibility, not just comfort. The beds themselves were often massive wooden structures that could not be easily moved. Some even had latches or locks on the canopy, allowing the curtains to be fastened tightly from the inside, turning the bed into a kind of wooden box of solitude and security. The communal bed, protection in numbers. For the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, a bed was not a solitary space. Families slept together, often in the same bed or in multiple pallets arranged closely on the floor. This included parents, children, infants, and even servants. Why? Warmth, human bodies generated and shared heat. Surveillance, keeping children close helped protect them from danger. Defense, multiple adults in a single room or bed increased nighttime security. Space, many homes had only one room. Shared sleeping was the only option. In wealthier households, servants sometimes slept on trundle beds beneath their master's main bed, able to rise quickly if summoned or to guard against intruders. This proximity was not merely practical, it also created a sense of nighttime cohesion. The group was the defense. Isolation, even in sleep, was a risk. The bed as a social border. For women especially, the bed could be a zone of autonomy and a site of vulnerability. In marital arrangements, the bed was both a legal and symbolic space. A marriage was often considered valid only after consummation in the bed, witnessed or confirmed by midwives, servants, or family members. Yet this same bed was also a place where women were expected to be available for sex, for childbearing, for care of others. In noble households, a woman's bedchamber could be visited by stewards, clergy, or political guests. And yet some women used their beds as a retreat. Widows, nuns, or noblewomen sometimes chose to withdraw from household affairs by refusing to rise from bed, citing illness, prayer, or grief. In literature and religious writing, we see the idea of the bed as a symbolic fortress, a place where a woman could either submit to or resist the demands of the world around her. Sleeping with weapons. Accounts from military households or frontier settlements often describe weapons kept close to the bed, and not metaphorically. Knights, mercenaries, and even common men in unstable regions would keep swords hung above or beside the bed, daggers under pillows, clubs or maces leaned against bedposts, boots and cloaks ready at the bedside. In some places, crossbows were loaded and set against the wall, ready for use. Why? Because raids were real, border skirmishes, bandits, night assaults. People had to be ready to rise from sleep and defend themselves within seconds. In castle bedrooms, you might find trapdoors beneath rugs, leading to escape tunnels, or arrow slits in the walls, usable even from within the Lord's chamber. Sleep did not mean surrender. It meant strategic retreat, but only until danger called again. Symbolism in bed construction. Beds were not just functional, they were often designed to communicate power, legacy, and vigilance. In wealthy homes, bedposts were carved with religious imagery, family crests, or protective symbols, crosses, saints, heraldic beasts. The high bed elevated well off the floor was both a status symbol and a practical measure. It kept sleepers away from rats, damp, and drafts, above the level of floor smoke, in view or out of reach. Ladders or stools were needed to access the bed, reinforcing the notion that this was not a casual space. It was a platform, a stage, and a kind of throne. In fact, many lords and monarchs received guests in bed, fully robed, sitting upright with cushions and hangings drawn. This was not indolence. It was a controlled space where the ruler remained on a protected perch, even while supposedly at rest. From cradle to grave, lifelong vigilance. Even the deathbed in medieval Europe retained this defensive symbolism. To die in one's own bed was a privilege. It meant dying protected, surrounded, not taken suddenly in the open or on the road. People prayed to die in bed with sacraments, as opposed to outside or alone. The bed, by life's end, had become the last stronghold against the unknown. Monks, too, viewed their pallets as sacred spaces, not indulgent but symbolic of withdrawal from the temptations of the flesh, of readiness for judgment, of a body humbled before God. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never just about rest. It was about safety, strategy, shielding oneself and one's family from the dark, from the cold, from spirits, from violence, and sometimes even from other people in the same room. The bed was a boundary, and boundaries, as history has shown, must always be guarded. But what happened when these guards failed? When beds were breached by enemies, by illness, or by fate itself? What did it mean to be unsafe, even in the one place designed to hold you fast? The bed, we have seen, was a fortress, draped in curtains, flanked by weapons, guarded by proximity and architectural design. It served not only to comfort the weary but to shelter the vulnerable. And yet, for all its structure, symbolism, and strategy, the bed could not always hold. We step into the darker spaces of history, those moments when the fortress of sleep was breached, and the very place designed for protection became a site of danger. These were the nights when the danger came inside, when trust was violated, or when the body itself betrayed its sleeper. From assassinations to plague, from political purges to the whispered crimes of intimacy. The bed was as much a place of risk as it was of rest. Night of the Long Knives, betrayal in bed. In the year 936, a young German king named Otto I became ruler of East Francia. After years of internal instability, he decided to purge his political rivals. The event came to be known in chronicles as a form of cleansing, though it was more a calculated massacre. The setting, their beds. Otto sent soldiers in the night to arrest or execute dissenting nobles while they slept. Some were dragged from their beds, others killed as they stirred, still tangled in sheets and furs. This method swift, quiet, and in the dark had a clear message. Even your own bed cannot save you. Though Otto's event was not officially named the Night of the Long Knives, the phrase has become a grim motif throughout history, a night of betrayal in which trust is punished and sleep becomes a vulnerability. The murder of King Duncan. Though Shakespeare's version is dramatized, the real murder that inspired Macbeth is grounded in the common medieval fear, regicide in the bedchamber. In 1040, King Duncan I of Scotland was killed in battle, but some sources suggest he may have been murdered while a guest in Macbeth's home, and perhaps even while asleep. Whether true or legend, the idea of being killed in one's sleep by a host or kinsman captured the medieval imagination. It was considered the ultimate breach of custom, religion, and personal security. Medieval kings often slept with guards posted inside the bedchamber or even in the same bed. Privacy was not the goal, safety was. Even popes, emperors, and bishops were not exempt from the fear. The closer the power, the greater the risk that the threat was within the walls. Disease in the curtains. Assassins were not the only danger. The medieval bed was warm, moist, shared, and draped in fabric. For disease, it was a perfect breeding ground. The Black Death in bedside horror. In 1348, as the plague swept across Europe, its most terrifying symptom was the speed with which it killed. Many were reported to have gone to bed seemingly well and been dead by dawn. Some accounts from Italy and France record whole families perishing overnight, with bodies found still in bed. Neighbors afraid to enter homes where windows were dark. Servants refusing to touch or approach bedclothes. The curtains that once sheltered sleepers became prison walls, trapping the sick and spreading the infection. Doctors began advising households to air out bedding or even burn mattresses. In some places, sumptuary laws limited the number of layers on a bed to reduce contagion. A well-made bed, once a mark of wealth, became a liability. Murder in the bedchamber, real crimes, intimate spaces. While high-profile assassinations attract attention, it was in private homes that many of the most tragic betrayals occurred. Domestic violence and control. Records from 13th and 14th century England, Paris, and Florence show court cases in which husbands murdered wives, or wives killed husbands, in bed. These crimes were often the result of long-standing domestic abuse, committed without witnesses in the deep of night, sometimes discovered only days later, when neighbors noticed the silence. In one chilling London coroner's roll from 1326, a husband claimed his wife had not woken after he accidentally struck her in bed. The bedding was bloodied. She had been strangled. The medieval justice system struggled with these cases, as bedchambers were private, intimate, and often legally ambiguous. Marital rights were ill-defined. The concept of spousal rape did not exist. The bed, once a shield from the outside world, offered no protection from those within it. Spiritual insecurity, the vulnerability of the soul at rest. In medieval theology, sleep was sometimes viewed as a symbolic death, a temporary separation of the soul from the body. This meant the bed was not only physically vulnerable, but spiritually as well. Monastic texts warned that demons could assault the soul during sleep. This was especially feared in children and unbaptized infants, women during menstruation or pregnancy, the dying, whose final thoughts might be corrupted in the liminal space between life and death. As a result, many people slept with crosses hung above the bed, psalms memorized and recited before lying down, protective amulets under pillows, sometimes blessed by clergy. The fear wasn't just of dying in sleep, it was of dying unconfessed, or dreaming sinful things, or encountering spiritual harm in one's most unguarded state. For some, the solution was to sleep lightly, or wake often to pray, a form of holy vigilance, to keep the soul on guard even when the body rested. The political weaponization of the bed. In courts and noble houses, the bed was often a stage for political performance. This made it ripe for manipulation. Fabricated affairs and accusations. During the 14th century trial of Queen Isabella of France, rumors were spread that she had taken lovers into her bedchamber while her husband King Edward II was away. Whether true or not, these stories were used to justify a coup. To accuse someone of corrupting the bed, whether through adultery, sorcery, or improper rituals, was a way to undermine their legitimacy, especially if they were in power. In some courts, the queen's bedding was examined after her wedding night to verify consummation. Blood on sheets was political proof. The bed was not private, it was public theater, and the consequences of what occurred there could topple thrones. Earthquakes and collapsing structures. Even architecture could fail. Several chronicles from the 12th and 13th centuries tell of earthquakes, roof collapses, or structural failures that crushed sleeping occupants. In Naples, 1293, an entire wing of a noble house collapsed at night, killing a count and his wife in their bed. Chroniclers interpreted this as divine punishment, but others saw it as a grim reminder. Even stone does not always hold. The fear of natural disaster prompted some households to sleep on lower floors or near exits, keep shoes and cloaks within reach, say blessings before sleep invoking protection from storms. The dismantling of trust. Perhaps the most lasting trauma of a breached bed is not the physical harm, but the dissolution of trust. In all the examples above, from regicide to disease, from domestic violence to spiritual danger, the lesson is the same. The bed cannot guarantee safety. When that guarantee is broken by a spouse, a friend, an illness, or even an idea, it reshapes how one relates to rest. Sleep becomes something to fear. The very act of lying down becomes an exposure. Some chroniclers describe survivors of nighttime attacks or loss as forever changed, sleeping only in chairs, never lying flat again, keeping lamps or candles burning through the night, waking every hour to check locks, windows, and doors, refusing to share beds, even with family. These are not just behaviors. They are symptom signs of a world where the fortress of the bed has failed, and the psyche carries the cost. If the bed can no longer protect, what then? Must we redesign it, rebuild it, reinforce it? Or must we accept that no fortress is ever absolute? You awaken and stretch in your own bed. The room is warm. Your door is closed. A lock, perhaps electronic, keeps the outside world at bay. If danger exists, it is far away, abstract. You are not likely to be attacked, not likely to be robbed in the night. You sleep behind walls, behind doors, behind systems designed to ensure your rest is safe. But this concept that your bed is private, peaceful, and secure is surprisingly recent. We trace how the medieval bed, a tool of vigilance and a shield against danger, evolved into the modern bedroom, a sanctified space of personal peace. We'll examine how architecture, society, technology, and changing ideas of self gradually dismantled the defensive structures of sleep, replacing them with privacy, comfort, and eventually, individualism. Yet even today, echoes of those ancient fears still linger in how we arrange our bedrooms. the rituals we follow at night, and the stories we tell ourselves as we close our eyes. From great hall to private chamber. In early medieval households, especially among the nobility, sleeping was often done in the great hall, the same space used for feasting, political meetings, and religious ceremonies. At night, the floor would be covered with straw pallets, blankets and furs, bedroll carried by servants or lower-ranking guests. Even lords might sleep in public view, separated only by curtains or a raised dais. In monasteries, rows of monks slept side by side in a single dormitory, dressed in their robes, under the watchful eye of a superior. Privacy was not considered a right or even a virtue. Communal sleep was normal, and security was found in company, not solitude. It wasn't until the 12th and 13th centuries that noble homes began to incorporate dedicated bedchambers, often built on upper floors for defensibility. These were not entirely private either. Servants still entered freely, and family members might share the space. Yet the trend had begun. Walls were going up literally and socially. The emergence of the bedroom. By the 15th century, we begin to see the rise of the chamber in French estates and English manors, a room explicitly designed for sleep and personal retreat. These spaces featured fireplaces, allowing for nighttime warmth, window shutters for darkness, locks on doors, still rare but increasingly common, heavy beds with built-in platforms, drapes, and carved decorations. The bed itself remained an object of symbolism and display, but now the room around it was growing in importance. Instead of guarding the bed within the room itself became the barrier. In urban homes, especially among the merchant classes, multi-room households began to emerge. Sleeping in a separate space became associated with status, propriety, and intimacy. And with that came a new idea, that one's bedroom was not just a space of rest, it was a space of self. Night and the individual. In the medieval world, sleep was largely regulated by nature, sunrise, sunset, by the church bells for prayers, and by the demands of one's household or feudal obligations. People didn't choose when to sleep. They slept when they could, often with others, and in ways that prioritized survival over comfort. But as urbanization increased and domestic architecture developed, so did a sense of personal nighttime routine. We begin to see in personal journals and household manuals references to retiring to one's chamber, lighting candles or oil lamps for private use, reading before sleep, locks and bolts being used routinely, families creating children's rooms separate from their own. By the 17th century, the modern notion of the bedroom was forming a room not just for sleep, but for withdrawal, reflection, and control over one's space and time. And with this, a strange reversal occurred. Privacy became protection, not strength in numbers, not weapons at the door, but walls, solitude, and silence. Furniture of fortification, from bed curtains to blankets. As sleeping arrangements evolved, so did the furniture of sleep. The towering canopy beds of the medieval period gradually gave way to lower frames, simpler linens, lighter bedclothes, feather mattresses replacing straw and wool. Curtains, once vital for warmth and concealment, began to disappear. In their place came blankets, comforters, and later duvets, less about defense, more about personal comfort. The pillows once shared among families became individualized. Even beds themselves were no longer shared by necessity. Couples and children began to sleep separately when possible. By the 19th century, sleeping alone in one's own bed, once considered sad or dangerous, had become a mark of modern respectability. This evolution paralleled broader shifts in how people understood the self. In a world where individuality, privacy, and domestic space were increasingly valued, the bed stopped being a fortress against others and became a sanctuary for oneself. Modern parallels to medieval fears. And yet we still carry pieces of the past. Burglar alarms, security cameras, and door locks are now our sentinels. We place our beds away from doors or facing windows, often unconsciously. Many people still sleep with lights, sound machines, or pets nearby. In some cultures, the practice of sleeping communally remains a norm, especially in times of crisis. Even the rise of sleep aids and anxiety treatments in modern medicine echoes medieval prayers and charms, different methods, but the same goal: to make sleep feel safe. Perhaps we have not changed as much as we believe. The bedroom as symbol. Today, the bedroom is one of the most personal spaces in the modern world. It is a retreat, a canvas for self-expression, a repository for secrets, emotions, and memories, a place of recovery, dreaming, and at times grief. But its origins are not rooted in comfort. They are rooted in need, in fear, and in the relentless human desire to find rest in a world full of threats. The medieval bed, tall, curtained, surrounded by armed guards or family bodies, was not romantic. It was functional, strategic, and fraught. The modern bed, silent, soft, surrounded by walls and the hum of electric peace, is its descendant. Not free of worry, perhaps, but built on generations of vigilance. Final reflection: what remains of the fortress? You close your eyes at night and you are alone. You trust the walls, you trust the locks, you trust the world outside to stay where it is. But inside your brain, deep in the oldest parts of your instinct, something remains. The sense that to sleep is to let go, to surrender, and that perhaps, just perhaps, some part of you still watches. Not for assassins, not for plague, but for the shadows, the sounds, the cold, or the memory of how long it took for humanity to make sleep safe. In this way, the fortress remains not around the bed, but within you. And now, as the fire dies down and the house grows still, you pull the covers to your chin and drift toward rest, knowing that somewhere long ago, someone else did the same and dreamed of peace. Story 6. Dreams, Demons, and Divine Visitations. Night visions in medieval thought. You are lying in the dark. Your body is still, but your mind is adrift. Perhaps you see visions: a storm at sea, a church in flames, a woman cloaked in blue who says your name. You awake not in fear, but with the weight of meaning. In the medieval world, this moment, the mysterious gap between sleeping and waking, was not ignored. It was studied, feared, prayed over, and recorded. We explore how people in the Middle Ages understood dreams not as idle fantasies of the brain, but as messages, warnings, or temptations. Dreams were language, and the medieval sleeper, whether monk or peasant, was expected to listen. Dream as communication. Today, we often speak of dreams as internal, projections of the subconscious, emotional processing, or nonsense stirred up by neural activity. But the medieval person believed that dreams were more likely to be external in origin. There were three primary sources of dreams recognized by medieval thinkers: divine dreams, messages from God, saints, or angels; natural dreams, reflections of the body's health or digestion; demonic dreams, temptations, illusions, or torments sent by evil forces. Each type required discernment, and the stakes were often high. A dream might offer a heaven-sent vision or a trap set by the devil. Dreams were not dismissed, they were interrogated. The legacy of ancient thought. Medieval ideas about dreams were deeply influenced by classical sources. Aristotle saw dreams as natural phenomena, signs of inner bodily conditions. Cicero questioned the reliability of dreams, but noted their power over belief. Macrobius, a Roman philosopher whose commentary on the dream of Scipio was widely read in the Middle Ages, categorized dreams into 5 types. Somnium, a symbolic dream requiring interpretation. Visio, a prophetic vision. Oraculum, a dream in which a divine being speaks. Insomnium, a nightmare from daily troubles. Visum, a waking vision, like an apparition. Medieval scholars, especially monastics, used these categories to analyze their own dreams, often writing them down in diaries or spiritual journals. These weren't idle reflections. They believed dreams could change the course of a life or foretell the death of a king. Monks and nightly visitations. For monks, dreams were both a gift and a danger. In monasteries across Europe, especially in the Benedictine tradition, dreams were discussed during spiritual direction. A novice who dreamed of fire, serpents, or women might be questioned by a superior. Was this a sign of temptation, of pride, of spiritual warfare? Some monastic rules even discouraged excessive sleep, fearing that a long, unguarded night could open the door to demonic influence. Yet monks also reported visions of Christ, conversations with saints, or vivid images of heaven. These dreams were carefully preserved, sometimes passed down or used to inspire reform. One famous account, written in the Vita of a 12th century Cistercian monk named Stephen of Aubezine, describes how he dreamed of a long road lined with candles. At the end was the Virgin Mary, who told him to remain silent for 7 days. When he woke, he obeyed. His silence changed his life, and the dream became part of his spiritual biography. Peasants and prophetic sleep. Though monks had the education to write about dreams, peasants were no less likely to value them. Village healers, midwives, and elderly women often acted as interpreters. Dreaming of bread might mean prosperity. A cow chasing you could indicate illness. A tooth falling out signaled death, perhaps not your own, but someone close. These interpretations were not standardized, but they often followed local traditions. In some rural French regions, dreaming of a snake biting you was seen as a sign that someone in the village had cursed you. In parts of the English countryside, dreams of water, especially overflowing wells, were thought to predict floods, emotional loss, or spiritual testing. Dreams could also be seen as omens of communal events, plague, famine, or war. In this way, they were not private experiences but shared signs, woven into village life. Women's dreams, feared and dismissed. Women's dreams held a paradoxical position in medieval thought. On one hand, women were believed to be more susceptible to visions due to their supposed emotional and physical softness. This made them both closer to divine insight and more open to demonic deception. Female saints like Hildegard of Bingen and Bridget of Sweden recorded vivid visions during sleep, often filled with rich symbolism. Towers of flame, rivers of gold, animals speaking in Latin. These were praised and published if the woman had ecclesiastical approval. But most women, especially those outside the church, were not believed. Their dreams were often dismissed as hysteria or moon-influenced nonsense. In witchcraft trials, dreams were sometimes used as evidence of demonic contact, especially if they included sexual imagery, flight, or dark figures offering gifts. A woman who dreamed too often or too vividly was watched carefully. Her bed became a site of both suspicion and vulnerability. The dream book tradition. By the 13th century, dream interpretation was a cottage industry. Manuscripts known as dream books were copied and sold across Europe. Many were based on older Arabic and Greek texts, reinterpreted for Christian audiences. These books listed common dream symbols and their meanings, often alphabetically. Apple, joy and less rotten than betrayal. Bridge, change or journey. Fire, passion or divine anger. Keys, access to secrets or hidden truths. Moon, instability or feminine power. These guides were used by everyone from monks to merchants, sailors to noblewomen. Some dream books even included astrological tables, linking the phase of the moon or planetary alignments to the likelihood of dreams being true or false. Such belief in structured dream reading gave people a sense of control over the chaos of the night, a way to make meaning from the uncontrolled wanderings of the mind. Demonic dreams and nightmares. But not all dreams were welcome. Some were terrors described by chroniclers as crushing, paralyzing, or suffocating. The word nightmare comes from the Old English mare, a malevolent spirit thought to sit on the chest of sleepers. These spirits were described in various forms across medieval Europe. In Germanic regions, the Alp or Mara. In Scandinavia, the mare, sometimes imagined as a riding woman or elf. In southern Europe, demons or incubi. In monastic Latin, oppressions nocturni, night oppressions. People who suffered frequently from nightmares might be thought possessed, cursed, or simply too sinful for peaceful sleep. To ward off such attacks, they would sleep with a crucifix or relic under the pillow, hang protective herbs like rue or vervain at the bedpost, say Psalm 91 before bed, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." The line between a bad dream and a spiritual assault was very thin. The dream as decision. For medieval people, dreams could be guiding tools. Stories abound of people changing their lives after a single vision. A knight dreams of falling into fire and joins a monastery. A peasant dreams of a hidden coin and finds it the next day. A sick woman dreams of a saint and then recovers. A king dreams of defeat and cancels a military campaign. Dreams held power, they were rarely ignored. Even royalty consulted dream interpreters, either clerical advisors or court mystics. The line between dream, prophecy, and politics was often blurred. To dream was not just to rest, it was to receive, to be tested, or to be warned. Closing thought: who was speaking? As the candles flickered low and silence settled in, the medieval dreamer turned inward but not fully. The world of dreams was not internal in the modern sense. It was a threshold, a corridor, a voice not quite your own. Every night the sleeper took a risk, to be influenced, to be tested, to be seen by something else. And as we prepare to explore the content of these dreams, what they meant, what they showed, and how they changed lives, we pause to ask. When the medieval mind dreamed, who exactly was speaking? When a modern person dreams, they may shrug it off. A curiosity, a shadow of thought. But for the people of the Middle Ages, dreams could upend lives, alter politics, justify sainthood, or spark war. We explore real historical dreams recorded between the 9th and 15th centuries, dreams that kings and peasants, monks and mystics claimed as truth. We'll visit dream diaries, chronicles, and hagiographies to see how these visions were interpreted, shared, feared, and sometimes used as tools of persuasion or power. Each dream served a purpose, each dream invited questions, and none were treated as meaningless. A king's dream before battle. Let us begin with one of the most famous royal dreams in early medieval Europe, that of Charlemagne, king of the Franks and Holy Roman Emperor. In the Vita Caroli Magni, his biographer Einhard tells us that before a major campaign against the Saxons, Charlemagne dreamt he saw a flaming sword fall from the sky, land between two rivers, and split into 4 smaller swords, each pointing in a different direction. The dream deeply unsettled him. His court chaplains interpreted it as a divine message. The campaign would begin in strength, but the empire would later be divided, a prophecy of both victory and eventual fragmentation. Whether the dream truly occurred or was retroactively invented is impossible to say. But the symbolism of the dream became part of the Carolingian mythos. For centuries, it shaped how later rulers saw Charlemagne not just as a conqueror, but as a chosen vessel, warned by heaven. Hildegard of Bingen's waking dreams. If ever there was a visionary in the medieval world, it was Hildegard of Bingen, 1098-1179, a German Benedictine abbess, composer, writer, and mystic. Beginning in childhood, Hildegard reported intense visions of the living light, many of which came during sleep or in half-waking states. Her first major visionary work, Civias, short for Cito Vias Domini, or Know the Ways of the Lord, records more than 24 dreamlike revelations. They are described in vivid, often surreal detail. A mountain covered in eyes. The breath of God warming the bones of Adam. A woman's body symbolizing the structure of the church. 7 flaming torches encircling the world. These were not idle images. Hildegard believed and convinced others that they were divine messages meant to be recorded and shared. The church eventually sanctioned her visions, and she became a respected spiritual authority. Her dreams blurred the line between sleep and revelation, vision and theology. The dream of the monk in Cluny. In the 10th century, a monk at the great Benedictine Abbey of Cluny recorded a strange and terrifying dream. It is preserved in the Liber Miraculorum, a book of visions, miracles, and warnings. The monk dreamed that he stood before the gates of heaven, where he saw souls burning in darkness. Each one called his name and begged for intercession. Among them were men he had known, a former prior, a carpenter, a cook. Each had been guilty of something seemingly minor: pride, laziness, greed. The vision concluded with an angel telling the monk, "Pray for them, for none pray anymore." The monk awoke shaking and immediately began a program of daily intercessory prayer for the dead one that spread through the monastery and became part of Cluniac's spiritual practice. Eventually, it would help inspire the church's embrace of All Souls' Day, a day to pray for the departed. A single dream, perhaps spurred by grief or guilt, changed communal behavior. The commoner and the coin. In a 14th century English town, chroniclers record the story of a blacksmith's wife who dreamed repeatedly of a silver coin buried beneath the hearthstone of a nearby chapel. After the third dream, she told her husband. They waited for a Sunday, attended Mass at the chapel, then with the priest's blessing lifted the stone. Beneath was a small box containing 3 coins and a broken ring. One coin was silver, marked with the image of a cross. The discovery was seen as a sign, a call to donate to the church. The priest took it as proof of local sanctity, and for years the site was visited by people seeking small miracles. Whether the dream was real or concocted after the fact is unknown, but the power of it lies in what people believed, that even the most ordinary person could be chosen to receive a sacred clue. Nightmares of guilt, the Crusaders' dream. During the Third Crusade, 1189-1192, a knight in the army of Richard, the Lionheart, reportedly confessed a disturbing dream to a chaplain. He had seen a giant serpent devour a group of sleeping men in armor. One of them wore his own crest. The dream was repeated for 3 nights. On the 4th morning he awoke, confessed his sins, and asked to be released from service. Though mocked by some, he left the army. A week later, his former company was ambushed. Many died, including a knight wearing his armor, which had been sold. The story, recorded by a chronicler in England, was used as a moral lesson. Repentance brings protection, but it also reflects a widespread medieval belief that dreams could offer warnings of personal doom and that heeding them might change fate. Saints who appeared in dreams. The medieval church was filled with stories of saints who visited the faithful during sleep. These dreams often came to the sick, the doubting, or the dying. A few notable examples. St. Nicholas was said to appear in dreams of sailors during storms, guiding them to safety. St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne reportedly visited a woman dying in childbirth and told her she would live, which she did. St. Thomas Becket appeared to several Londoners after his martyrdom in 1170, assuring them of his protection and calling for prayers at his shrine. Such dreams were considered proof of a saint's power, and were often used to promote pilgrimage sites. Church authorities would sometimes investigate these dreams, interview the dreamers, and record them as part of the growing hagiographic literature, making dreams part of the machinery of religious reputation. Court dreams and political use. Not all dreams were private, some were political weapons. In the court of King Henry VI of England, a monk named Richard of York claimed to have had a dream in which angels told him that Henry's line was doomed, and that the House of York was destined to reign. Though officially denounced, the dream gained traction among certain nobles. It was used in taverns and sermons, repeated in whispers feeding the growing tensions that would become the Wars of the Roses. Such dream claims, whether sincere or manufactured, were potent. They gave divine justification to ambition. Indeed, many pretenders to the throne throughout medieval Europe invoked dreams or visions to legitimize their claims. If God had spoken to them in sleep, how could they be wrong? The dream of death. One of the most solemn types of medieval dreams was the announcement of death, often symbolic, sometimes direct. A 13th-century monk in Burgundy recorded the story of a noblewoman who dreamed that a black-cloaked figure entered her chamber, extinguished her candle, and whispered, "Make ready." She died within the week peacefully, having received confession and communion. Such dreams were shared not only to inspire awe, but to encourage spiritual preparation. Sleep and death were already linked metaphorically, and dreams became the corridor between the two. Closing thought, can a dream be trusted? As we step back from these stories, dreams of snakes, swords, coins, and saints, we see a pattern. The medieval world took the night seriously. A dream was not merely personal, it was cosmic. It might signal sin or sainthood. It could lead to reform, pilgrimage, repentance, or rebellion. Yet one lingering question remains. If dreams came from many sources, God, demons, the body, or the self, how could one know which was which? What was divine and what was deception? And what happened when the dream's meaning refused to be clear? The medieval world was soaked in dreams. They flowed through monasteries and marketplaces, shaped kings and peasants, and whispered across bedchambers after candlelight faded. But no cultural current holds forever. We trace how the medieval reverence for dreams began to shift subtly at first, then decisively with the changing winds of science, philosophy, and theology. By the end of the 15th century, dreams were no longer unquestioned messages from God or demons. Instead, they became puzzles of the mind, curiosities of medicine, and sometimes inconvenient embarrassments. The question was no longer, what does it mean? But rather, why do we dream at all? Theological tightening, suspicion, and silence. By the late Middle Ages, the Church itself began to grow more cautious of dream enthusiasm. Earlier centuries had allowed a certain spiritual fluidity. Saints dreamed, monks recorded visions, laypeople shared omens and warnings. But as heresies multiplied, especially in the wake of popular mystics and apocalyptic dreamers, church authorities started drawing firmer lines. In the 14th century, a growing number of synods and councils discouraged clergy from promoting unauthorized visions. The line between private piety and public revelation became dangerous. Even nuns and monks were asked to submit their dreams to confessors for scrutiny. The Inquisition, originally formed to combat heretical movements, sometimes took a hard stance on dream-based prophecy. Claims of divine dreams could bring suspicion, especially if the message challenged church hierarchy. Thus, dreams went from sacred to suspect. Their wings were clipped, their keepers warned. The rise of skepticism, humanism, and reason. Parallel to the Church's narrowing stance was a broader cultural shift, the early roots of the Renaissance and humanism. Scholars like Petrarch and Erasmus, while steeped in classical knowledge, often expressed doubt about mystical experiences. Though Petrarch recorded dreams of his beloved Laura, He approached them as expressions of memory and grief, not divine encounters. In medical faculties, particularly in Italian universities like Padua and Bologna, physicians revived Galenic theories of digestion, sleep, and dream causation. They argued that dreams were natural products of the humors, especially black bile and choler, rising from digestion during sleep. A heavy meal might cause violent dreams. An overheated brain might produce nonsense. This wasn't a new idea. Aristotle had said much the same, but now it returned with the force of science rather than speculation. Dreams were no longer the exclusive domain of God or devil. They were the steam of the body. The human soul was no longer a battlefield. It was, increasingly, a laboratory. The printing press and dream books reborn. One curious side effect of the Gutenberg printing press, invented, was the explosive spread of dream books. Though church authorities discouraged dream obsession, popular appetite remained. By the late 15th century, inexpensive pamphlets offering alphabetical dream interpretations flooded cities from Nuremberg to Paris. These often bore little theological weight and included secular symbols like games, fish, or weddings. Some editions linked dreams to lotteries, suggesting what number to play based on what one dreamed. A pig might mean 9, a ladder 14, a tooth 32. Dreams, once mystical, had become commodities. They could be bought, consulted, and wagered upon. The quiet, sacred space of the medieval sleeper had become part of the commercial city. The dreamers who refused to let go. Yet not everyone moved on. Even as the Renaissance spread its light, many people, especially in rural regions, held tightly to the medieval view. Dreams were still considered warnings, promises, or punishments. A vision of a burning tree or a weeping statue might still prompt a pilgrimage or donation to a local church. In 16th century Spain, a peasant woman dreamed of the Virgin Mary weeping over heresy in her village. She told a traveling friar, who relayed it to the bishop. Within months, a local preacher was denounced for doctrinal errors. Was it truly divine, manufactured, coincidence? No one could be sure. What is sure is this: dreams still mattered. They still moved people to act, believe, and fear. The shadow of Freud, a new era begins. We must briefly leap forward, though it is beyond the medieval horizon. In 1899, Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams. For the first time in centuries, the dream regained centrality, but now as a psychological artifact. Not divine, not demonic, but personal. Freud saw dreams as wish fulfillment. His follower, Carl Jung, interpreted them as symbols of the collective unconscious. Suddenly, dreams were no longer medieval corridors of spiritual warfare. They were inner stories, keys to the self. This did not erase medieval beliefs. If anything, it paralleled them. Medieval people also thought dreams mattered. They simply placed the cause outside the self, where Freud placed it within. The question shifted from, what is this dream saying about God, to what is this dream saying about me? But the need to interpret, to search, to believe, that never really changed. Echoes in the modern bed. Today, fragments of medieval dream culture linger quietly in corners of our culture. We still say, "I had a weird dream," and pause, searching for meaning. We speak of nightmares and trace their roots to ancient spirits. Some wear dream catchers, echoing not medieval but similarly ancient beliefs in sleep protection. People still dream of falling, teeth, flying, and wonder what it all means. Entire industries exist around dream interpretation books, astrology-linked dreams, or lucid dream training. Even science has not resolved dreams fully. Neurology maps REM cycles and memory consolidation, but the symbolic strangeness of dreams remains stubbornly outside the reach of complete explanation. Perhaps that's why they endure, because like the medieval monks and midwives, we too believe secretly or openly that the night might speak. Final reflection: sleep as sacred time. In the end, the medieval fascination with dreams teaches us something gentle and enduring. They believed the night was not empty, that sleep was not a shutdown, but a threshold, that our most vulnerable moments when the fire burned low and the wind moved the shutters were not meaningless. They left room for mystery, for the possibility that we are more than flesh, that something or someone watches, that our fears and hopes take shape in ways beyond logic. They believed that even in sleep we are seen. So tonight, as you drift off, know this: you are doing something very old. You are entering a space that for most of history was sacred, where voices spoke, where angels warned, where saints appeared, where souls wrestled with shadows. Close your eyes gently and remember, the dream was never just yours. It was a message,